Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Few voices in modern history have lived so many lives inside one human throat. Frank Sinatra was not only a singer, not only an actor, not only a name glowing above theaters, casinos, records, and headlines. He became one of those rare figures who seemed to move with the century itself, carrying its glamour, its loneliness, its ambition, its danger, and its appetite for reinvention. If you enjoy these long, carefully told stories, a gentle like and subscribe helps Quiet Chronicles continue bringing new histories each week. And before the story begins, tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It is always a pleasure to know how far these quiet journeys travel. If there is a person, era, story, kingdom, city, artist, or mystery you would like covered next, leave that too, and it may become a future chronicle. This is the complete story of Frank Sinatra, the boy from Hoboken who learned how to bend a song around a breath, then watched that gift carry him through fame, collapse, return, power, rumor, age, and memory. The beginning is not in Las Vegas or Hollywood or under the lights of a crowded theater. It begins across the Hudson River in Hoboken, where a difficult birth and a forceful family placed Francis Albert Sinatra into a world already full of noise, pressure, and possibility. Chapter 1. Hoboken before the voice. Hoboken in 1915 was a small city pressed tightly against the Hudson River, close enough to Manhattan for its towers, ferries, and promises to feel near, but far enough for a working family to know that distance in wages, accents, and opportunity. It was a place of peers, boarding houses, tenements, political clubs, parish loyalties, and immigrant households where respectability had to be built one rent payment, one favor, and one public reputation at a time. German, Irish, Italian, and other communities had already left their marks on the city, and the waterfront gave Hoboken a hard, practical rhythm. Men came and went with ships, rail yards, trucks, and docks. Families learned to live with noise, closeness, and the knowledge that a child's future might depend as much on nerve and patronage as on schooling. Into that city came Francis Albert Sinatra, born on December 12, 1915, to Italian-American parents whose own lives carried the pressure of arrival and self-making. His mother, Natalina Garaventa Sinatra, known to nearly everyone as Dolly, had been born in northern Italy and brought to America as a child. His father, Antonino Martino Sinatra, known as Marty, had come from Sicily and remade himself through physical work, local recognition, and a series of occupations that required endurance more than ease. Their son was born into a household where affection, pride, temper, and expectation were not separate forces. They lived together inside the same rooms. The birth itself entered family memory with unusual force. Sinatra was a large baby, and the delivery was difficult enough that instruments were used, leaving injuries to his face, neck, and ear that remained part of the physical record of his life. The left eardrum was damaged, and marks from the birth stayed with him into adulthood, though later audiences would rarely think of the famous face in terms of its difficult arrival. That first event mattered less as omen than as family fact, the kind of story a household repeats until it becomes part of a child's private mythology. For a man later described through polish, tuxedos, phrasing, and elegance, the beginning was neither polished nor elegant. It was strenuous, local, and bodily, like much of the world around him. Dolly Sinatra became the stronger public presence in the family, and her influence over her only child was one of the permanent facts of his early life. She worked as a midwife and moved through local democratic politics with energy, memory, and command. In a city where favors, ward loyalties, and neighborhood service mattered, Dolly understood the value of knowing people and being known by them. She could be generous, severe, practical, and formidable, and those who remembered her often remembered the force before the softness. Her son grew up under a woman who did not treat the world as something to be passively endured. She pushed against it, negotiated with it, and expected her household to stand visibly within it. Marty Sinatra carried a different kind of presence. He had boxed under the name Marty O'Brien, a choice that revealed something about the ethnic calculations of the time, when an Irish ring name could be easier to sell than an Italian one. Later, he worked as a firefighter, a position that gave him public standing and a stable identity in Hoboken's civic life. He was less verbally dominant than Dolly, and later accounts often place him in the background of the family's emotional weather, but background did not mean absence. In a household like theirs, a father's labor, uniform, and reputation still formed part of the child's understanding of manhood. Strength did not always announce itself in speech. Francis was their only child, and that fact shaped the family's inner atmosphere. Attention did not have to be divided among brothers and sisters. Praise, worry, anger, ambition, and correction could all gather around him with unusual intensity. He grew up not as one child among many, but as the one on whom a mother's force and a father's steadiness could settle. Later, when Sinatra seemed to expect rooms to arrange themselves around his presence, the habit had older roots than show business. Before radio audiences, before theater crowds, before musicians waited for his entrance, there was the concentrated theater of a small family where one boy received the full pressure of being watched. Hoboken offered him a world of compressed social signals. A boy learned who had money, who had influence, who could speak to a policeman, who could get a cousin work, who had failed, who was respected, and who was not. The city's scale made reputation immediate. A family name could travel from a kitchen to a stoop, from a stoop to a shop, from a shop to a political room, and return by evening carrying some new judgment. In such a place, performance was not only entertainment, it was a way of moving through the world, of making oneself larger than circumstance allowed, of turning charm, posture, clothing, speech, and nerve into forms of currency. Sinatra's schooling did not suggest a settled academic path. He attended local schools, including A.J. Demarest High School, but his interest did not remain there long enough to become a conventional future. The classroom could not compete with the feeling that life might be entered by a side door, through sound, daring, and public approval. He was drawn to music in a time when music was already changing the shape of American aspiration. Records, radio, dance bands, and film made distant voices feel intimate, and a poor or working-class listener could hear in them not only songs, but models of escape. The microphone made nearness portable. Bing Crosby mattered deeply to that young imagination. Crosby's style suggested that a singer did not need to force himself across a hall in the old theatrical manner. He could lean into the microphone, soften the line, and make the listener feel privately addressed even when millions were listening. Sinatra absorbed that lesson before he had the training to transform it. He heard not merely a famous singer, but a method of modern presence. This was a quiet revolution in popular music, because it changed the singer from a projected performer into a companionable voice. Sinatra's later art would become more dramatic, more exact, and more rhythmically daring, but the early discovery remained important. A voice could cross distance by sounding close. The young Sinatra did not yet possess the disciplined phrasing that would later define him. What he had first was desire, and desire can be a rough instrument before it becomes craft. He sang at local gatherings, listened closely, and began to imagine himself apart from the ordinary expectations of Hoboken work. A family that had struggled for standing could regard such ambition with both pride and alarm. Entertainment promised visibility, but it did not promise security. For immigrant families, security had moral weight. It meant that sacrifices had not been wasted. A son who wanted applause instead of a trade could look, depending on the hour, like either a fulfillment or a risk. Small stages and local rooms gave Sinatra his earliest education in attention. A singer learned quickly when people were listening out of politeness, when they were distracted, and when the room had truly turned. Those early settings did not carry the glamour later attached to his name, but they supplied something more useful than glamour. They taught proportion. A voice had to meet the size of the room, the mood of the crowd, the patience of accompanists, and the limits of its own breath. Even before formal success, Sinatra was learning that singing was not only sound, it was timing, placement, confidence, and the subtle management of expectation. Dolly's ambitions for her son did not always align neatly with the uncertainty of show business, but her temperament gave him an example of force. She knew how to enter public life without asking permission from it. Marty's life gave another example, quieter and more physical, of a man making himself acceptable in a city that measured usefulness closely. Between them, Sinatra inherited a complicated mixture: his mother's drive and appetite for recognition, his father's working respectability, and his own early hunger to be heard. None of these elements alone explains him. Together they formed the pressure under which the young singer began to harden into purpose. Hoboken also gave him something he would later carry even when he seemed far removed from it. The city's nearness to Manhattan meant that glamour was visible, but not possessed. Across the river lay theaters, hotels, radio studios, publishers, nightclubs, and the grand machinery of American entertainment. From Hoboken, Manhattan could be both neighbor and rebuke. It showed what was possible, while reminding a young man that possible did not mean available. The ferry route across the Hudson was therefore more than transportation. It marked the distance between local promise and national recognition, a distance Sinatra would spend his early life trying to narrow. The earliest version of his ambition had not yet found its proper structure. He was not yet the disciplined band singer, not yet the Columbia idol, not yet the capital interpreter of loneliness and swing. He was a thin young man from Hoboken, shaped by a fierce mother, a quieter father, a crowded city, and the modern spell of voices traveling through wires and records into ordinary rooms. The gift was present, but gift alone rarely carries anyone very far. It needed a contest, a bandstand, a microphone, a first professional chance, and the discovery that beyond Hoboken there were audiences willing to listen before they knew exactly whom they were hearing. That discovery began in modest places, with amateur appearances, local applause, and the first signs that a boy who had grown up under the intense notice of one household might learn to hold the attention of strangers. The next step would not be smooth, and it would not yet be grand. It would pass through borrowed arrangements, small payments, radio contests, and a group whose name still carried the city he was trying to leave, even as it gave him his first opening toward the larger American ear. Chapter 2: The Amateur Hour and the First Escape. Bing Crosby reached the young Frank Sinatra before Sinatra reached any serious audience of his own. Crosby's records and radio performances had shown a new possibility inside popular singing, one that did not depend on the old theater voice or the stiff projection of an earlier stage. He sounded easy, conversational, almost private, and the microphone helped turn that ease into a modern form of intimacy. For a young man in Hoboken, listening from the edge of the entertainment world rather than from its center, this mattered. Crosby made the profession seem less like a distant ceremony and more like something a person might enter if he possessed timing, nerve, and a tone that could travel. Sinatra's earliest attempts to follow that path were not yet disciplined enough to carry the mark of mastery. He had not learned the long breath, the suspended phrase, or the carefully delayed entrance that later made musicians listen to him with respect. What he had was hunger, and hunger often arrives before technique. Around Hoboken and nearby towns, he sang where a young hopeful could sing, in social rooms, amateur settings, and local gatherings where applause was available but never guaranteed. These were not minor experiences to the person living through them. A singer who later faced national radio and theatre crowds first had to learn the more immediate uncertainty of a room that might decide within a few lines whether it wished to keep listening. The American entertainment ladder in the 1930s was full of small rungs. Radio contests, amateur hours, neighborhood engagements, dance band jobs, and touring units all formed a restless middle ground between obscurity and recognition. Talent did not move upward by talent alone. It needed a sponsor, a contest, a lucky hearing, a vacancy in a band, or the approval of someone already standing inside the business. Sinatra entered that world with little formal protection. He was not born into theatre management, publishing, recording, or radio. His early advantage was narrower and more volatile. He believed intensely that he belonged somewhere beyond the scale of his beginnings. The Hoboken Four gave that belief its first national shape. The group was originally built around local singers, and Sinatra joined in a way that already suggested his mixture of ambition and impatience. They were not a polished vocal institution, and their name carried a useful plainness, as if the city itself had become their credential. When they appeared on Major Bowes' Amateur Hour in 1935, they entered one of the most important popular gateways of the period. Major Edward Bowes' program offered ordinary performers a chance to be heard across the country, and the format made hope into a public ritual. Listeners could imagine that unknown talent gathered from towns and neighborhoods might be pulled into view by a single broadcast. The result was encouraging enough to move the group into touring, though touring as an amateur hour success did not mean luxury. It meant schedules, modest pay, shared quarters, practical discomforts, and the discovery that being chosen once did not settle a career. Sinatra had already begun to separate himself in ambition from the group that had helped carry him forward. The public could hear four young men, but Sinatra was beginning to imagine one name. That small imbalance is worth noticing, because it returned throughout his life in more elaborate forms. He could belong to a band, a label, a film studio, a nightclub circle, or a political friendship, but he rarely ceased measuring the space between the group and himself. After the Major Bowes' success, the road became a rough apprenticeship. Amateur fame had a short life unless it could be converted into professional usefulness. The young singers traveled, performed, and learned how quickly novelty thinned when repeated night after night. For Sinatra, the experience carried him away from Hoboken without yet delivering him into the future he wanted. It also sharpened the difference between applause and career. Applause could happen in a moment. A career required people who would pay, book, record, arrange, and repeat the association often enough for a name to settle into public memory. Local performance remained part of his education after the Hoboken Four period loosened. He worked as a singing waiter at the Rustic Cabin in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, a roadhouse that gave him something more valuable than its modest status might suggest. The Rustic Cabin had a wire connected to radio broadcasts, and Sinatra's singing there reached listeners beyond the tables in the room. A job like that sat halfway between service work and show business. He was near the public, but not yet above it, visible, but still required to be useful in ordinary ways. The details matter because they show how porous early entertainment work could be. A man might carry plates, wait for his cue, and then sing into the machinery that was beginning to make him known. At the Rustic Cabin, Sinatra had to sing repeatedly, not as a special event, but as a working function of the place. That kind of repetition can be severe training. Songs had to be carried through imperfect conditions, uneven attention, and the practical noise of a commercial room. A singer learned how to hold the line when no one treated the line as sacred. Later, when Sinatra became known for control, it would be easy to imagine that control emerging only from elite studios and expert arrangers. Some of it began in less refined circumstances, where a young performer discovered that phrasing had to survive the room before it could command one. Harry James entered Sinatra's life as the first bandleader of national importance to give him a professional opening. James, a trumpeter with a bright, forceful sound and rising reputation, heard Sinatra and brought him into his orchestra in 1939. The association did not last long, but its importance was greater than its duration. It moved Sinatra from hopeful local singer into the organized world of touring dance bands, where timing, discipline, and public image mattered every night. In that world, a vocalist was still partly subordinate to the bandleader, but the vocalist could also become the reason certain listeners leaned closer. The first recordings with Harry James did not yet announce the full Sinatra of the 1940s and 1950s. They show a young singer finding his place inside arrangements that did not belong to him. The voice is recognizable, though not yet fully settled into the later authority. A modern listener may hear the beginnings more easily than the original audience could have done, because history teaches the ear what to notice. At the time, he was one promising singer among many in a crowded field, and the music business did not lack young men willing to stand before a microphone and offer feeling in a clean suit. Still, Sinatra had qualities that made musicians and band leaders pay attention. He listened carefully, entered phrases with unusual sensitivity, and seemed to understand that a lyric could be handled as speech without becoming casual. There was also the matter of breath. He had not yet formed the famous method associated with Tommy Dorsey's influence, but he was already moving toward a style that stretched lines and made pauses feel chosen rather than forced. Such details do not sound dramatic when described plainly, yet they are the substance from which a singing career is made. A vocalist's authority may rest on a fraction of a beat, on the decision not to land where another singer would land, on the ability to make restraint feel like confidence. James offered Sinatra a contract, and Sinatra accepted the chance, but another opportunity soon arrived with greater force. Tommy Dorsey's orchestra was one of the most admired bands in America, smoother and more established than James's organization, with a style that could teach Sinatra precisely what he still needed. Moving from James to Dorsey required negotiation and release, and it brought Sinatra closer to the center of the big band world. Harry James later became part of Sinatra's origin story with generosity rather than bitterness, an early example of how the singer's ascent depended not only on his own will, but on the decisions of men who could have slowed him and instead let him pass. The late 1930s music world was built around orchestras, not yet around solitary singers as the dominant stars of popular music. Dance bands filled ballrooms, hotels, radio programs, and record catalogs. Band leaders were names of power, and vocalists were often featured as one color within a larger arrangement. Sinatra entered that order just as it was beginning to shift. The public taste for singers was growing, and radio carried voices into homes with an intimacy that dance halls could not reproduce in the same way. The vocalist was no longer merely the person who delivered the lyric between instrumental passages. He could become the emotional center of the record. That change did not happen because of Sinatra alone, but his timing placed him in the path of it. He had come out of Hoboken with the desire to be heard, moved through amateur contests that turned ordinary ambition into broadcast possibility, and found his way into professional bands just as American listeners were becoming more attentive to the singer's personal sound. The old structures had not vanished. Bandleaders still controlled contracts, arrangements, billing, and many of the practical routes into fame. Yet something was beginning to tilt. When a young vocalist could make listeners remember the song through the grain of his own voice, the balance of power inside popular music began to change. Sinatra's departure from Harry James for Tommy Dorsey was therefore more than a career adjustment. It was the next stage in a long apprenticeship of attention. With James, he had entered the professional road. With Dorsey, he would learn polish, breath, and the value of a phrase that seemed to continue beyond the ordinary limit of the lungs. The young man who had once sung as part of the Hoboken Four was moving toward a larger discipline, and the group name that had tied him to his city began to fall behind him. What remained from Hoboken was not the label, but the pressure, the need to be noticed, the refusal to remain small, and the instinct that every room, no matter how crowded, could be made to turn toward one voice. The next room belonged to Tommy Dorsey, and it was not an easy room to command. It was orderly, exacting, polished by professional expectation, and filled with musicians who knew the difference between confidence and craft. Sinatra entered it still young, still unfinished, and still carrying the raw urgency of escape. What he found there was a bandleader whose trombone seemed to breathe without breaking, and from that sound the singer began to learn how a line could be carried farther than the listener expected, until breath itself became part of the song's hidden architecture. Chapter 3. Learning Breath from Tommy Dorsey. Tommy Dorsey's orchestra stood near the polished center of American popular music when Frank Sinatra entered it in early 1940. The band was known for smoothness, discipline, and a kind of elegant control that made its performances feel effortless, even when everything inside them depended on precision. Dorsey himself was already one of the great trombonists of the swing era, a musician whose tone could carry a melodic line with unusual length and softness. For Sinatra, who had come through amateur contests, local singing, the rustic cabin, and Harry James's brighter, more brassy organization, the move brought him into a world where talent alone would not be enough. He had to learn how to become exact without sounding stiff. Dorsey's band was not merely a group of musicians traveling from engagement to engagement. It was an institution with its own hierarchy, arrangements, expectations, and public identity. The band leader's name stood above the singer's, and the singer's task was to serve the arrangement while finding a place inside it large enough to be remembered. This was a useful discipline for Sinatra, though it was not always an easy one for his temperament. A young man who already believed in his own future had to stand at a microphone and understand that, for the moment, the orchestra came first. The lesson would stay with him long after he no longer accepted second billing. Tommy Dorsey's trombone became one of Sinatra's quiet teachers. Dorsey could sustain a phrase with a smoothness that seemed to hide the labor of breath, letting one note move into another without the listener feeling the mechanics underneath. Sinatra noticed. He later described studying Dorsey's playing and trying to learn how a singer might carry a line in the same unbroken way, breathing where the listener would not feel the break. This was not imitation in the narrow sense. A trombone and a human voice do different things, but the idea mattered. A phrase could be shaped as one continuous thought, and breath could be managed so carefully that emotion seemed to unfold without interruption. That discovery became part of Sinatra's mature art. His later reputation often rests on feeling, timing, and interpretation, but underneath those qualities lay a practical discipline of breath. A singer who can hold a line slightly longer than expected can change the listener's sense of time. He can delay arrival, soften emphasis, or make a lyric seem less like a set of measured bars and more like a private thought being released at its own pace. With Dorsey, Sinatra learned that technical control did not have to sound technical. It could become a form of ease. The orchestra itself offered another education. Its musicians knew arrangements from the inside, and they understood the balance between individual sound and collective shape. Sinatra was surrounded by players who could hear whether a vocalist entered too early, leaned too heavily, or disturbed the band's movement. The road sharpened these lessons. Ballrooms, theaters, hotels, radio broadcasts, and recording sessions all demanded slight adjustments, because no two rooms returned sound in quite the same way. In one place, the band might feel broad and warm. In another, the singer had to be more careful, placing consonants and vowels so the lyric would carry without strain. The singer's public image also began to refine itself in this period. Sinatra was thin, neatly dressed, and visibly young, with a face that did not yet carry the harder lines of his later years. His appeal did not come from physical grandeur. It came from the strange intimacy that arrived when he sang, the impression that the lyric was being considered rather than merely delivered. Girls in the audience noticed him first with the kind of intensity that institutions often underestimate until it becomes impossible to ignore. The orchestra still belonged to Dorsey, but a new center of attention had begun forming near the vocalist's microphone. Joe Stafford and the Pied Pipers were part of this musical environment, and their presence helped place Sinatra inside a broader vocal texture. The big band singer had to know when to step forward and when to fold back into ensemble work. Recordings such as I'll Never Smile Again, made with Dorsey and the Pied Pipers, showed how a soft, melancholy vocal arrangement could hold public attention during uncertain years. The song's success was not built on force. It moved through restraint, and restraint suited Sinatra's growing understanding of how closeness could be more powerful than display. In that sense, the Dorsey period did not merely make him more famous. It taught him how little he sometimes needed to do. Radio increased the reach of these lessons. A live appearance ended when the room emptied, but a broadcast could carry the voice into houses, apartments, shops, and bedrooms far from the bandstand. People who had never seen Sinatra could begin to know the shape of his singing. The technology favored vocal personalities who sounded immediate rather than distant, and Sinatra was becoming one of them. He was learning to sing not only to the room before him, but to an unseen listener who might be sitting close to a radio in a completely different city. That unseen listener would become one of the central figures in his career. The early 1940s were also years of professional tension. Sinatra's growing popularity created pressure inside the very structure that had helped him rise. Dorsey was the band leader, employer, and established name. Sinatra was the young vocalist whose following was expanding with unusual speed. The arrangement between them could not remain emotionally simple, because the marketplace was beginning to value the singer in a new way. A band could introduce a voice, train it, frame it, and benefit from it. Yet once the public attached itself to that voice, the singer might begin to seem larger than the frame. Contracts made that tension practical. Sinatra's relationship with Dorsey included obligations that would later complicate his move into solo stardom. The famous accounts of his release from Dorsey's contract have often been surrounded by rumor, embellished stories, and later associations with intimidation. But the essential fact is plain enough. Sinatra wanted out, and leaving was not simple. He had entered the orchestra as a young singer in need of a platform. He left as a performer whose value had increased so sharply that the terms of release became part of his legend. When rumor gathers around a career, it often attaches itself most firmly to moments where ambition and money are already visible. During the Dorsey years, Sinatra was also learning the cost of being watched. The more attention he received, the more his movements carried meaning for others. Fans wrote letters, followed appearances, and began to treat him not merely as a singer, but as an object of emotional investment. This was not yet the full bobby-soxer phenomenon that would soon surround him, but the outlines were already there. American popular culture was discovering how intensely young listeners could organize feeling around a performer. Sinatra did not invent that condition, though he became one of its clearest early examples. A small but important shift occurred as audiences began to hear songs through him rather than merely hearing him perform songs. The difference is subtle, but it matters. A vocalist becomes durable when listeners feel that the song has passed through a recognizable inner weather before reaching them. Sinatra's gift was not a large voice in the operatic sense, nor was it the richest natural instrument of his generation. Its power lay in phrasing, attention, and the impression that every line had been weighed. With Dorsey's orchestra behind him, he learned how to let that weighing happen inside disciplined musical structures. The band's success carried Sinatra into a more visible professional world, but it also made return to anonymity impossible. Once a singer has heard audiences respond not only to the melody but to the particular way he bends it, a different future becomes hard to refuse. Sinatra's ambition, already strong, now had evidence to feed on. The young man from Hoboken could see that the public was not merely tolerant of him, it was beginning to choose him. That knowledge can steady a performer, but it can also make patience more difficult. The road with Dorsey had taught him craft. It also convinced him that the road was no longer wide enough. Dorsey, for his part, remained one of the decisive figures in Sinatra's formation. Later independence did not erase the apprenticeship. The breath, the line, the seriousness of arrangement, the understanding that ease could be manufactured through discipline, all of these belonged partly to the Dorsey period. Even Sinatra's later authority as a solo artist rested on lessons learned in an environment where he had not yet possessed authority. This is one of the quieter ironies of artistic development. A performer often becomes himself by first submitting to someone else's structure. When Sinatra finally moved beyond Dorsey, he did not leave behind the orchestra's influence. He carried it into the next phase, where the bandstand would give way to a different kind of public fever. The singer, who had studied a trombonist's breath, was about to discover that his own breath could unsettle theaters full of young listeners. What had been growing inside ballrooms and broadcasts would soon gather outside stage doors, in aisles, in press columns, and in the tremulous devotion of wartime audiences who heard in his voice something close enough to touch and distant enough to adore. The discipline of Tommy Dorsey's orchestra had given Sinatra a method. The next years would give him a crowd. Chapter 4. The Bobby-soxer Years. The crowd that gathered around Frank Sinatra did not arrive all at once, though later memory often makes it seem sudden. It formed through radio, records, theater appearances, magazine photographs, and the strange emotional climate of the early 1940s, when American life was being reorganized by war and young listeners were learning to attach their private longings to public voices. Sinatra had left Tommy Dorsey with a new discipline in his singing and a growing belief that the orchestra frame had become too narrow for him. The band years had taught him how to phrase. The solo years would teach him what could happen when phrasing met mass feeling. Columbia Records became the first major house of that solo identity. With Axel Stordahl arranging behind him, Sinatra moved into a gentler, more string-shaped sound than the swing orchestra had usually given him. The arrangements made room for the voice, and the voice filled that room with careful softness. He did not sound like a man trying to overpower the listener. He sounded as though he had found a way to stand very close without raising his volume. For wartime audiences, that nearness mattered, because absence had become one of the ordinary facts of American life. Sons, brothers, husbands, and sweethearts were away in uniform, and popular music carried a great deal of feeling that daily speech could not always hold. Paramount Theater in New York became one of the clearest places where this feeling showed itself. Sinatra appeared there in the early 1940s, and the crowds of young female fans, soon called bobby-soxers, became a phenomenon of their own. They waited, pressed forward, screamed, fainted, wrote letters, and treated his appearances less like ordinary theater engagements than emotional events. The term bobby-soxer came from the ankle socks associated with teenage girls of the period, but the clothing detail became attached to something larger, the emergence of youth as a visible, organized force in popular entertainment. They were not merely listening. They were declaring a new kind of audience power. At the Paramount, Sinatra's body seemed almost slight against the scale of the reaction he produced. He was thin, narrow-faced, still youthful, and nothing in his appearance alone explained the force of the crowds. The explanation lived in the singing, but also in the timing of the singing. His voice arrived at a moment when the country was full of waiting for letters, waiting for ships, waiting for casualty lists, waiting for the war to end, waiting for ordinary life to resume. Sinatra's ballads did not need to name the war directly in order to belong to it. A song of longing could become wartime property simply by being heard in wartime rooms. The bobby-soxer response unsettled older observers. Newspapers and commentators could treat the fans as silly, excessive, or faintly alarming, because adult culture often dismisses young emotion before it understands its organization. Yet there was a historical signal inside the noise. Popular music was beginning to prove that teenagers could move markets, fill theaters, shape publicity, and turn a singer into a national object of fascination. Sinatra became an early test case in this new arrangement. The girls in the aisles were not a decorative detail around his career. They were part of the mechanism that made the career impossible to ignore. Columbia understood the value of this attention and recorded Sinatra in ways that emphasized intimacy. Stordal's arrangements used strings, woodwinds, and softened textures that left his phrasing exposed. The result was not always favored by later critics as much as the Capitol years would be, but it suited the young solo star of the wartime period. Songs such as "There Are Such Things," "People Will Say We're in Love," and "Saturday Night is the Loneliest Night of the Week" belonged to a musical world of separation, romance, and controlled ache. Sinatra's voice was not yet the darker instrument of his later ballads. It still carried youth, but youth under pressure. The war shaped his public position in more complicated ways. Sinatra did not serve in the armed forces, having been classified as unfit for military service, partly because of the damaged eardrum that traced back to his difficult birth. In a country where military service had become one of the strongest measures of masculine duty, that classification could not remain a private medical fact. It became part of public discussion, suspicion, and resentment. Some accepted the explanation, others did not. The same mass attention that made him beloved also made him vulnerable to judgment, and the distance between adoration and accusation could be crossed with surprising speed. Sinatra responded to the war through performance rather than enlistment. He appeared for troops, participated in wartime entertainment, and became part of the home front culture that tried to keep morale alive through songs, films, radio, and public events. The Armed Forces radio service and V-discs helped circulate music among servicemen, and performers who stayed home could still reach military audiences through these channels. This did not erase the criticism, but it placed Sinatra inside a larger wartime entertainment system. A singer could not carry a rifle through Europe or the Pacific, but his records could follow men into barracks, ships, hospitals, and temporary resting places far from home. The contrast between his young female audience and the soldier audience became part of the complexity of his fame. To bobby-soxers, Sinatra could seem tender, available, wounded, and devoted through the very shape of his singing. To some servicemen and older men, he could appear too soft, too adored, too safely distant from the war's physical demands. This division says as much about the culture around him as it does about Sinatra himself. A voice that sounded intimate to one listener could sound evasive to another. Fame made the same qualities visible from several angles at once. Hollywood also began to draw him more strongly during these years. Film studios saw in Sinatra not only a singer, but a marketable presence attached to a highly active fan base. He appeared in musical films, often in roles that used his youth, slightness, and vocal appeal rather than any deep dramatic authority. The films extended his reach and gave his fans another surface on which to fasten attention. A record could be replayed, a radio broadcast could be remembered, but a film allowed the singer's image to circulate repeatedly with the songs. The entertainment industries were beginning to braid themselves around him. Still, the very speed of Sinatra's rise created conditions that would later trouble him. Public appetite is rarely stable. It can intensify until it seems permanent, then shift toward irritation, fatigue, or a newer object. The bobby-soxer phenomenon made him a symbol of youth feeling, but symbols age faster than artists. A singer who becomes famous through the devotion of teenagers must eventually face the question of whether the wider public will follow him into adulthood. Sinatra's answer had not yet been formed. For the moment, the crowds were large, the records sold, the fan letters arrived, and his name carried a charge that publicists could scarcely have designed better. The press followed him closely, and press attention brought both enlargement and distortion. Stories of fainting girls, theater disorder, romantic speculation, and wartime criticism turned Sinatra into a figure discussed even by people who were not listening carefully to his records. This is one of the odd features of celebrity in the modern age. A performer can become known partly through descriptions of other people's reactions to him. The crowd becomes part of the star's identity, and after a while the public may know the screaming before it knows the song. Sinatra's early solo fame carried exactly that danger. The reaction threatened to obscure the craft. Yet the craft continued to develop beneath the reaction. He was still learning how to bend lyrics towards speech, how to delay a phrase without seeming mannered, how to make a ballad feel as though it were being thought through in the moment of singing. In the Columbia years, his voice had not yet acquired the grain, smoke, and authority of the 1950s, but its intelligence was already visible. He treated words carefully. He understood that a line could be weakened by too much emphasis and strengthened by restraint. Even when the surrounding publicity made him seem like a sudden fever, the singing itself was more patient than the headlines. The home front made room for this patience because many listeners were living with private uncertainty. A teenage girl hearing Sinatra on the radio might not have needed an elaborate musical explanation for his effect. She knew only that the voice seemed to understand waiting, loneliness, devotion, and the drama of being young in a time when the adult world had become frighteningly large. That knowledge was enough. Popular songs often do their historical work in this way, carrying emotions that later historians can name but that listeners at the time simply inhabit. Sinatra's early audience did not require theory. It required a voice that made feeling feel recognized. By the middle of the 1940s, Sinatra had become one of the most visible entertainers in America. He had moved from Hoboken to amateur contests, from Harry James to Tommy Dorsey, from orchestra vocalist to solo idol, and from singer to phenomenon. The scale of the ascent was remarkable, but it also left him exposed. The public had learned to magnify him. Soon it would learn to tire of him, and the same machinery that had built his image would begin to report its weakening with equal energy. For a while, though, the theaters still filled, the girls still waited, and the voice still carried across wartime America with an intimacy that seemed almost impossible for so public a thing. Sinatra stood in the center of an attention that was both gift and trap. Beyond the applause lay recording contracts, film offers, newspaper columns, and the fragile expectation that the feeling he produced in 1943 and 1944 could remain unchanged. It could not. The young idol would have to become something else, and before that reinvention came, he would pass through years when almost everything that had lifted him began to loosen beneath his feet. Chapter 5. The fall no one expected to last. Ava Gardner entered Frank Sinatra's life when his public certainty had already begun to weaken. The early force of the bobby-soxer years had not vanished in a single season, but the fever around him was cooling, and the culture that had once seemed to bend toward his voice was beginning to move with less obedience. Columbia still recorded him. Hollywood still used him. His name still mattered. Yet something in the machinery had changed, and Sinatra, who had risen so quickly that fame seemed almost to have chosen him, found himself facing the older and colder truth that fame can also withdraw its favor without asking permission. The late 1940s were not kind to the kind of singer Sinatra had become. Musical taste was shifting. The swing era was no longer carrying the same power, and the soft wartime balladeer who had once seemed to speak for waiting girls and absent soldiers now had to live in peacetime air. The emotional conditions that had helped magnify him were no longer arranged in quite the same way. Audiences did not simply disappear, but their attention wandered. Records that might once have seemed inevitable now sold less strongly. A performer who had been treated as the future could feel, with surprising speed, like a memory of a mood that had passed. Nancy Barbato Sinatra had been part of his life before the crowds. She had married him in 1939 when his professional future was still uncertain, and she had remained tied to the household that existed behind the public figure. Their children, Nancy, Frank Jr. and Tina, belonged to the more private geography of Sinatra's life, the rooms and family obligations that newspapers could report, but never truly contain. Nancy represented continuity, the world before the theatre shrieks and the magazine covers. But continuity could not protect a marriage from the pressures gathering around it. Sinatra's rise had brought him into nightclubs, film sets, parties, studios, and a social world where attention was constant and restraint was not always rewarded. Ava Gardner belonged to that world with a force different from Sinatra's. She was one of Hollywood's most striking women, admired for a beauty that seemed less manufactured than dangerous to those who tried to manage it. Sinatra's attachment to her became one of the central emotional events of his decline, not because a romance can explain an entire career, but because the timing placed private upheaval beside public loss. Their relationship drew press attention, damaged his domestic image, and placed him in the role of a man visibly undone by his own longing. For a singer who had made emotional vulnerability profitable, it was a hard turn to have vulnerability become public fact. The marriage to Nancy ended, and Sinatra married Gardner in 1951. The new marriage carried glamour, but not peace. Both were famous, both were volatile, and both lived in industries that turned private strain into public property. The press followed the relationship closely, and Sinatra's pain became part of his public outline. There were arguments, separations, reconciliations, and the sense of two people drawn together with a force that did not make life easier for either of them. The subject has often been treated with melodrama, but the quieter historical point is enough. At almost the same moment his professional footing weakened, Sinatra's emotional life became exposed, unstable, and widely discussed. His voice also began to trouble him. Years of performance, pressure, and strain affected the instrument on which everything depended. A singer can survive bad notices, poor scripts, or failed publicity more easily than uncertainty in the throat. When the voice feels unreliable, the body itself becomes part of the career's danger. Sinatra had built his public value on the impression of control, of a line held with ease, and a phrase shaped exactly as he wished. Vocal trouble disturbed that illusion from within. The audience might hear only a missed note or a rougher performance, but the singer heard the possibility of something more frightening, the loss of the means by which he had entered the world. Hollywood did not immediately rescue him. MGM and other studios had used him in musicals and light entertainment, but the roles often depended on the younger Sinatra, the slim romantic singer whose fan base seemed ready-made. As that image aged and the fan fever declined, the films began to feel less secure. He was not yet trusted as a serious dramatic actor, and he was no longer quite the miraculous new singing idol. This middle condition can be unforgiving. Entertainment industries like clear categories. Sinatra was becoming difficult to place, which is one of the most dangerous things a star can become. The press, once eager to describe the size of the crowds around him, now found other stories to tell. Columns lingered on romance, temper, cancellations, poor attendance, professional sitbacks, and the sense that Sinatra's moment had passed. A star's decline becomes easier to report once the first reports of decline have appeared. Each weak performance confirms a pattern, Each empty seat becomes symbolic. Each personal difficulty seems to explain the whole public fall. This is not always fair, but celebrity rarely operates by fairness. It builds a figure out of repetition, and then it weakens that figure by repeating the weakening. Sinatra's temperament did not soften the process. He could be generous, loyal, and exacting, but he could also be angry, impulsive, and unwilling to accept humiliation quietly. The qualities that had helped him push out of Hoboken and through the band system did not always serve him well in decline. Ambition becomes more painful when it has already tasted success. A young unknown can imagine future applause. A fallen star remembers it. Sinatra was not merely trying to become famous. He was trying not to lose the self that fame had confirmed. Financial and professional pressures gathered around the emotional ones. Engagements became less dependable. Record sales fell, and the public mood that had once sustained him no longer carried the same tenderness. There were moments when his name still opened doors, but fewer doors led to the center of the room. In some accounts of this period, Sinatra appears nearly finished, a former idol wandering through the ruins of his own early promise. That picture can be too neat, because he was still working, still known, still capable. Yet the central truth remains. For a brief span, the entertainment world behaved as though it had used up what it wanted from him. Gardner's own career continued with an independence that complicated Sinatra's sense of himself. She did not exist merely as the woman in his story. She had her own fame, her own contracts, her own public magnetism, and her own struggles. In the marriage, Sinatra could seem both devoted and wounded by the fact that her professional standing remained strong while his faltered. Private love and public comparison became difficult to separate. A man accustomed to being adored by crowds found himself attached to a woman whose glamour he could neither possess nor escape. One of the most delicate features of these years is that they later became useful to Sinatra's art. The pain did not ennoble itself while it was happening. It was disorder, humiliation, longing, and exhaustion. But after the comeback, when his Capitol recordings gave shape to adult loneliness with such authority, listeners could hear in them something that seemed earned. This does not mean that suffering automatically creates art, or that private damage should be treated as a necessary price. It means only that Sinatra later found musical forms capable of holding what these years had done to his public and private imagination. The older Bobby-soxer image could not have carried such weight. The young idol of the early 1940s had sounded tender, but he had still belonged to youth. The singer who emerged after the collapse would carry a different kind of tenderness, one marked by fatigue, irony, regret, and controlled bitterness. Before that voice could become an artistic fact, the public had to stop seeing him only as the boy who made girls faint. Decline helped destroy that image. It took away the easy glow and left behind a performer who would have to return as a man rather than as a fever. The role that would reopen the future came from a film rather than a record. From Here to Eternity was adapted from James Jones's novel and set in the army world before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Sinatra wanted the role of Angelo Maggio with unusual intensity, and the desire itself made sense. Maggio was not a glamorous romantic lead. He was smaller, sharper, vulnerable, and doomed by the structure around him. For Sinatra, the part offered a way to be seen without the burden of the old image. He did not need to appear triumphant. He needed to appear human enough for the public to reconsider him. The casting was not inevitable. Hollywood had doubts, and Sinatra's weakened position did not make him the obvious choice. The later stories around how he obtained the role have grown dense with rumor, partly because The Godfather would famously echo a version of a singer seeking a film part through dangerous influence. The historical record is more complicated and less theatrical than legend prefers. What matters for the Chronicle is that Sinatra did get the part. and that the part did what no publicity campaign could have done as cleanly. It allowed audiences to see him reduced, exposed, and useful inside a serious film. Before the film appeared, however, Sinatra remained suspended in uncertainty. His marriage was troubled, his career unstable, his voice not always dependable, and his public image damaged by overexposure and backlash. Yet the old discipline had not disappeared. The training from Dorsey, the early radio intimacy, the habit of listening closely to a lyric, and the stubborn Hoboken refusal to accept smallness still remained inside him. A career can look finished from the outside while its materials are quietly rearranging themselves. The fall, then, was not the end of the story, though it felt close enough to one. It stripped away the early shape of Sinatra's fame and left him with fewer illusions about the durability of applause. The next opening would come through a barracks, a military story, and a supporting role that placed him among stronger bodies and harsher men on screen. In that smaller space, away from the old theatre hysteria and the fragile sweetness of the Columbia idol, Sinatra would begin to recover the one thing more valuable than popularity: the public's willingness to look at him again. Chapter 6: Angelo Maggio and the Return. Angelo Maggio was not the largest role in From Here to Eternity, and that was part of its usefulness to Frank Sinatra. The film did not ask the audience to receive him as the young romantic idol they had already begun to outgrow, nor as the stage figure surrounded by cries, gossip, and fading expectation. It placed him inside an ensemble, under the discipline of a serious story, among actors whose physical presence and dramatic authority could have made him disappear if he had arrived with only charm. Instead, the smallness of the role gave him a different kind of space. He could return to public attention without seeming to demand it. The film came from James Jones's novel about army life in Hawaii before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Fred Zinnemann directed it with a restraint that suited the material. The world of the story was not built for musical glamour. It was made of barracks, rank, boredom, discipline, resentment, and men held inside systems that did not care very much about their private wounds. Burt Lancaster, Montgomery Clift, Deborah Kerr, Donna Reed, and Ernest Borgnine all occupied strong positions within the film's dramatic structure. Sinatra, as Maggio, entered as a smaller man among them, quick, loyal, vulnerable, and marked by a kind of nervous brightness that did not need to be inflated. For Sinatra, the part arrived after years in which inflation had become dangerous. The public had once made him too large, then watched as the image shrank. Maggio allowed another scale. He was not presented as the center of the story, and that helped release Sinatra from the burden of proving that he still belonged at the center of anything. A supporting role can be merciful in that way. It lets an actor be observed rather than tested by memory. Viewers did not have to decide whether the old Sinatra had returned. They could simply notice that the man on the screen was effective. The route to the role has always carried more legend than certainty. Sinatra wanted it badly, and he pressed for it at a time when his professional need was obvious. Later, the story of a singer obtaining a film part through pressure and influence became part of American popular mythology, especially after The Godfather offered its own fictionalized echo of Hollywood coercion. The historical case around Sinatra was less neat than the legend that grew near it. There were recommendations, advocacy, studio calculations, and the practical fact that Sinatra's thinness and emotional edge suited Maggio better than a more conventionally powerful actor might have done. Rumor followed the casting because rumor had already learned to follow Sinatra. What matters inside the film is easier to describe. Maggio gave Sinatra a character whose dignity did not depend on victory. He was lively, mocking, loyal to Montgomery Clift's Pruitt, and vulnerable before forces larger than himself. The part drew on qualities Sinatra possessed but had not always been allowed to show on screen: quickness without smoothness, pride without command, tenderness under a defensive surface. In earlier musical roles, his slightness could seem youthful or decorative. Here it became dramatic information. The body that had once made him look like a delicate idol now made Maggio look exposed in a harsh military world. Zinnemann's direction did not encourage excess, and that restraint benefited Sinatra. The performance had to remain within the film's sober atmosphere. Maggio's moments did not become set pieces for a singer trying to remind viewers of his old magnetism. They belonged to the story's pressure. Sinatra's speech, movement, and expression carried enough urgency to register, but not so much that the character broke the film's tone. This balance was essential. A comeback performance cannot appear too eager to be a comeback performance. If the audience sees the need too clearly, sympathy may turn into resistance. The Academy Award that followed changed the meaning of the part. Sinatra won Best Supporting Actor for From Here to Eternity in 1954, and the award provided a public confirmation that no nightclub booking or press campaign could have supplied with the same authority. Hollywood, which had seemed uncertain what to do with him, now had a new category available. He was no longer only the singer whose fans had screamed, or the fallen idol whose marriage filled columns. He was an Oscar-winning actor. The phrase did not erase the difficult years, but it gave the next version of his career a sturdy public fact on which to stand. Award ceremonies often compress years of labor, embarrassment, luck, and negotiation into a single visible moment. In Sinatra's case, that compression was unusually powerful. The comeback had not begun with the Oscar alone, and it would not be completed by it alone, but the award fixed the turning point in public memory. A man who had been described as nearly finished was now applauded by the industry that had partly doubted him. The old story of decline did not vanish. It became the necessary first half of a more satisfying narrative. Hollywood also gained from the arrangement. The entertainment industry likes evidence that it can rediscover someone, that it can recognize value after neglecting it, and that failure can be rearranged into triumph without admitting too much responsibility for the failure. Sinatra's return through Maggio suited this appetite. His own history gave the film's reception an added emotional layer, while the film gave his history a new respectability. The role and the man reflected each other without becoming identical. Maggio was not Sinatra, but audiences could feel why Sinatra had needed Maggio. The success of From Here to Eternity did not automatically repair every part of his career. Record companies, club owners, film studios, and audiences still had to decide what kind of Sinatra they wanted after the comeback. A single performance could reopen a door, but it could not furnish the whole house. The next stage required musical judgment as much as publicity. The young Columbia idol could not simply be restored. His voice had changed, his image had changed, and the country around him had changed. If he was to return as a singer, the material had to match the man who had survived the fall. Capitol Records became the place where that matching began. The label had the studio resources, arrangers, and artistic environment capable of giving Sinatra a new sound. The move mattered because it placed him in a setting where the long-playing album was becoming more than a container for songs. It could become a sustained mood, a sequence, a carefully arranged emotional world. Sinatra had always understood individual lyrics, but the Capitol years would allow him to think in larger shapes. A record could have an atmosphere without becoming vague. It could carry an adult feeling across many tracks, with each arrangement contributing to the whole. The difference between the Columbia Sinatra and the Capitol Sinatra was not merely age. At Columbia, the young solo singer often sounded tender, smooth, and romantically immediate, with arrangements that pressed his voice inside a soft frame. At Capitol, the frame could grow darker, sharper, more rhythmically alive, or more spacious according to the project. The voice had acquired more grain, and the man behind it no longer seemed untouched by disappointment. Listeners who had once heard yearning could now hear recollection, irony, confidence, regret, and wit. The instrument had not simply recovered, it had become more complicated. This complication suited the America of the 1950s in ways different from the wartime years. The country was wealthier, more suburban, more consumer-driven, and more invested in adult style. Nightclubs, hi-fi systems, LP jackets, cocktail hours, and Hollywood glamour all helped create a market for music that sounded sophisticated without becoming inaccessible. Sinatra stepped into that world with unusual authority because he could make sophistication feel personal. He did not sound like a lecturer in taste. He sounded like a man who had learned the cost of feeling and had decided to sing with control anyway. The film comeback and the musical comeback therefore fed each other. From Here to Eternity made the public willing to see him again. Capitol would make the public willing to listen differently. In both cases, the key was not a return to youth, but a release from it. Sinatra's earlier fame had depended partly on being young enough for young listeners to dream around him. His second fame would depend on seeming adult enough for listeners to trust him with disappointment. That change widened his audience and deepened his art. A quieter shift also occurred in his own authority. The experience of decline had made him less likely to treat success as a permanent condition granted by the world. He could still be volatile, demanding, and difficult, but the work itself gained a new seriousness. Sessions mattered, arrangements mattered, song choice mattered. The order of an album mattered. The way he entered a phrase, placed a consonant, leaned behind the beat, or left a word almost unsentimental became part of a larger artistic method. What had once been instinct and apprenticeship now moved toward design. The public comeback, then, was not one event, though the Oscar gave it a clean emblem. It was a sequence of recoveries crossing film, records, image, and self-command. Angelo Maggio opened the passage because he allowed Sinatra to be small enough to be believed again. Capitol would widen that passage by giving him a sound large enough to contain the man he had become. The next years would bring arrangers who understood that his voice no longer needed to be surrounded by youthful sweetness. It needed shape, shadow, swing, space, and the carefully built architecture of mood. At the center of that architecture would stand Nelson Riddle, along with Gordon Jenkins, Billy May, and the Capitol musicians who helped transform the comeback into one of the great recording periods of American popular song. Sinatra had returned through a film role that asked him not to sing at all. Now, with the public listening again, he was ready to make records that sounded as though the fall had not ended the voice, but taught it where to place the weight. Chapter 7: Capitol and the Architecture of Mood. Capitol Records gave Frank Sinatra something more useful than another contract. It gave him a room in which the second version of his career could be built with care. The Oscar for From Here to Eternity had restored public attention, but attention alone could not shape a song, choose a key, arrange a brass section, or decide how one side of an album should breathe into the next. For that work, Sinatra needed musicians who understood that the old sweetness of the Columbia years no longer suited him completely. The voice had changed, the face had changed, and the public memory of him had changed. A new sound had to carry all of that without explaining any of it. Capitol in the 1950s was well placed for such a rebuilding. Its studios in Los Angeles gathered arrangers, engineers, session players, and producers at a moment when recorded music was becoming more deliberate in its design. The long-playing record had opened possibilities that the older single could not fully contain. A singer could now build a sequence of songs around a mood, a season of feeling, or a carefully sustained emotional temperature. This mattered greatly for Sinatra, because his art had always depended on the treatment of time. He knew how to delay a word, lengthen a line, hold a silence, and make a phrase seem conversational while keeping it musically exact. The LP allowed that gift to operate on a larger scale. Nelson Riddle became the central arranger in this transformation. He was younger than Sinatra, formally skilled, and alert to the changing language of American popular music. Riddle did not bury Sinatra under ornament. He built settings around him, sometimes with a light rhythmic spring, sometimes with muted brass, sometimes with strings that did not merely soften the sound but gave it emotional direction. His arrangements could move with elegance and still leave space for the singer's phrasing. The best of them understood that Sinatra's voice did not need constant decoration. It needed an architecture strong enough to let restraint sound intentional. Riddle's importance is easy to underestimate because arrangers often remain half-hidden in popular memory. The public tends to remember the singer's name, the song title, and perhaps the album cover, while the musical structure that made the performance possible recedes into the background. Yet Sinatra's Capitol recordings cannot be understood without the men who shaped those structures. Riddle gave him lift and clarity. Gordon Jenkins gave him a more expansive melancholy, often with strings that could stretch sorrow across a wider surface. Billy May supplied drive, brightness, and a sharper swing. Around them stood musicians whose names did not always travel into popular conversation, though their work gave the records their living texture. The first great statement of the Capitol period came with In the Wee Small Hours in 1955. The album is often treated as one of the earliest major concept albums in American popular music, not because it tells a literal story, but because it holds a continuous emotional world. The songs gather around loneliness, late-night regret, memory, and the quiet afterlife of love. The cover helped complete the idea. Sinatra alone, under a blue-toned urban light, dressed as a man awake after others have gone home. It was not only packaging, it was part of the record's argument, if such a calm and wordless thing can be called an argument. The songs inside the album did not need to shout their sadness. They were arranged and sung as if sadness had already settled and no longer needed to announce itself. Sinatra's phrasing on such material carried the mark of a man who knew how to keep emotion under discipline. That was the real change from the younger balladeer. The early Sinatra often invited sympathy through tenderness. The Capitol Sinatra could suggest that sympathy was unnecessary, or at least beside the point. He sounded as though he had passed through the feeling before the song began, and the record preserved only the shaped remainder. This is one reason the Capitol years have remained so central to his reputation. They gave adult disappointment a style. Not a disguise, exactly, and not a cure, but a way of moving through it without collapse. A listener did not have to share the details of Sinatra's life to recognize the authority of the performance. The biography was present only as pressure behind the voice. Ava Gardner, professional decline, public humiliation, and the long return all hovered near the music, but the songs did not become diary entries. They remained songs, and that distance made them stronger. A different Sinatra appeared on Songs for Swingin' Lovers in 1956. If In the Wee Small Hours belonged to the late hour, Songs for Swingin' Lovers belonged to motion, wit, and renewed command. Nelson Riddle's arrangements moved with a buoyant confidence, and Sinatra sang as though the beat were something he could lean against, ride over, or delay for pleasure. The album's title used the language of lovers, but its deeper subject was mastery. The fallen singer had not returned only to suffer elegantly. He had returned with timing, appetite, and a sense of rhythmic authority that made even old standards feel newly awake. The swing albums depended on discipline as much as exuberance. Sinatra's ease with tempo came from a careful relationship with the band. He could sing behind the beat without losing it, enter slightly later than expected, or carry a phrase across the bar line so the lyrics seemed to breathe according to speech rather than measurement. These were not accidents of personality. They were decisions made by a singer who trusted the musicians and expected them to trust him. In such performances, the orchestra did not merely accompany him. It moved with him, sometimes like a finely driven machine, sometimes like a conversation whose pauses mattered as much as its replies. Capitol's recording environment helped preserve that relationship. The studio was not the same as the theatre, and Sinatra understood the difference. A theatrical performance could draw energy from the visible audience, but a recording required concentration on an unseen future listener. Microphone placement, balance, arrangement, and take selection all became part of the finished intimacy. Sinatra had learned from Crosby that a microphone could make closeness public. At Capitol, he refined that lesson into a larger art. He could sound relaxed without being casual, exposed without being weak, and commanding without needing volume. The album covers also contributed to the identity of this period. They presented Sinatra not as a teenage idol or a film novelty, but as an adult figure moving through moods recognizable to the post-war middle class. Solitude, romance, travel, nightlife, confidence, loss. A record sleeve in a store window or on a living room table could signal taste before the music began. This was part of the changing consumer culture of the 1950s, when hi-fi equipment, modern interiors, cocktail rituals, and carefully chosen records helped many Americans imagine themselves as more sophisticated than their parents' generation. Sinatra's Capitol albums fit that world without being reduced to it. He also knew how to choose material that carried durability. The songs were often drawn from the great American songbook, from writers whose work had already passed through theatre, film, and popular recording. Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, Harold Arlen, Johnny Mercer, and others gave Sinatra lyrics and melodies that could bear close interpretation. He approached these songs less as relics than as living pieces of language. A weaker singer might treat a standard as something to decorate. Sinatra treated it as something to inhabit, measure, and renew. Gordon Jenkins' work with Sinatra brought another dimension. Where Riddle often supplied balance, sparkle, and elastic motion, Jenkins could build slow, string-rich settings in which grief seemed to widen around the voice. Albums such as Where Are You, and later No One Cares, drew on that scale of feeling. The danger in such music was excess, because strings can easily instruct a listener too heavily in what to feel. Sinatra's best performances with Jenkins avoided that problem through vocal restraint. The orchestra might open the emotional space, but the singer did not always fill it to the edge. He left room for the listener's own memory. Billy May, by contrast, brought a more driving, brassy, and sometimes playful energy. His arrangements could make Sinatra sound sharper, more urban, more amused by the very act of swing. In those settings, the phrasing often carried a raised eyebrow. The singer who had been wounded in the ballads could become alert, quick, and socially dangerous in the up-tempo numbers. This range mattered because it kept the Capitol period from hardening into one mood. Sinatra did not become only the singer of midnight loneliness. He was also the singer of movement, flirtation, swagger, and controlled release. The best Capitol records therefore created a full adult landscape. They had rooms for solitude and rooms for company, hours of regret and hours of charm, songs for a man alone and songs for a man entering a crowded place already sure of his welcome. Their unity did not come from sameness. It came from the coherence of Sinatra's presence inside different arrangements. Whether the sound was sparse, lush, swinging, or shadowed, the listener encountered a singer who knew where he stood in relation to the song. That authority had been missing from much of the decline period. Now it returned, steadier because it had been tested. Commercial success followed, but the artistic importance of the Capitol years was not only commercial. These albums helped establish the idea that a popular singer could be a serious album artist. Before rock musicians made the LP a central artistic form in the 1960s, Sinatra and his collaborators had already shown that sequence, cover, mood, and arrangement could turn a set of songs into a larger statement. He did not do this alone, and the story should not pretend that he did. The achievement belonged to a partnership between singer, arranger, label, musicians, engineers, songwriters, and the recording technology of the time. Sinatra's genius was to stand at the point where all of those forces met and make them sound personal. The contrast with his earlier fame was striking. The bobby-soxer years had made him a vessel for youthful longing. The Capitol years made him an interpreter of adult experience. He no longer depended on the innocence of the audience devotion. He could meet listeners who had marriages, disappointments, private histories, ambitions, hotel rooms, office lives, long drives, and evenings they could not quite explain even to themselves. His singing did not solve any of that. It gave it form. This was also the period in which Sinatra's public authority expanded beyond records and films into style itself. The hat, the suit, the cigarette, the loosened tie, the controlled stance before the microphone, and the sense of a man who knew both the pleasures and costs of the night all became part of his image. Some of this was publicity. Some of it was performance. Some of it was personal habit made visible. The important point is that the image and the records strengthened each other. The man on the album cover seemed to have lived in the same emotional weather as the voice inside the grooves. Yet no artistic period remains untouched by the ambitions it creates. Success at Capitol made Sinatra powerful again, and power awakened his desire for more control. He had learned the value of the right arranger, the right room, the right song, and the right sequence. He had also learned how much of his work still depended on institutions owned by others. A singer who had once fought to escape the frame of the bandleader now began to feel the frame of the record company. Capitol had given him the sound of his restored greatness, but restoration did not make him less restless. That restlessness would soon move through Las Vegas, film sets, television, politics, and eventually his own record label. Before ownership came the room where his restored public self could be displayed night after night before adult audiences who wanted not the boy from Hoboken and not the fallen idol, but the man who seemed to carry disappointment and command in the same breath. The records had built that man in sound. Las Vegas would give him a stage broad enough to turn the sound into a kingdom of tuxedos, jokes, late hours, friends, money, and a new kind of American entertainment power. Chapter 8. The Sands and the Nightly Republic of Las Vegas. Las Vegas gave Frank Sinatra a different kind of stage from the recording studio, and it suited the public self he had built during the Capitol years. The records had taught listeners how to hear him as an adult interpreter of longing, wit, confidence, and regret. The Vegas showroom allowed them to see that authority arranged in physical form. The tuxedo, the microphone, the glass nearby, the orchestra waiting behind him, and the audience gathered close enough to feel included in the evening's private weather. He was no longer the thin young idol whose fans had overwhelmed theater aisles. He had become a man who could walk into a room already convinced that the room belonged to him. The Sands Hotel became the place most closely associated with this version of Sinatra. Its Copa room was not enormous by later arena standards, and that was part of its power. It made celebrity feel near. Guests who came to see Sinatra were not watching him from an unreachable distance. They were entering a carefully managed social space where music, jokes, money, drinks, friendship, and status seemed to pass across the same few yards of carpet and tablecloth. Las Vegas in this period did not sell only gambling. It sold proximity to glamour, and Sinatra was one of the figures who made that glamour feel personal. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop gathered around Sinatra in the public formation that came to be known as the Rat Pack. The phrase carried a loose informality, but the entertainment built around them was not loose in any simple sense. It depended on timing, repetition, stage knowledge, hierarchy, and a shared understanding of how far a joke could travel before it damaged the rhythm of the room. Martin brought a relaxed comic ease that made effort seem unnecessary. Davis brought astonishing versatility, speed, mimicry, dance, and the discipline of a performer who had worked since childhood. Lawford carried Hollywood polish and political connection. Bishop supplied a dry comic counterweight. Sinatra stood at the center, not always by official declaration, but by gravity. A Rat Pack night at the Sands could appear spontaneous because spontaneity was part of what the audience had paid to believe. A singer would begin a number, another would interrupt, someone would tease the orchestra, a joke would fold into a song, and the evening would seem to have loosened its collar. Yet underneath the ease lay an older discipline. These were experienced performers who understood entrances, exits, pauses, and the social temperature of a crowd. The looseness had a frame. The jokes might sound tossed away, but the show depended on knowing when to return to the music before the room's attention scattered. Sinatra's authority in that setting came partly from his refusal to separate singing from presence. He did not treat the songs as isolated formal objects, placed one after another for appreciation. They arrived inside a larger social performance. A ballad could quiet the room after a run of jokes. A swing number could lift the energy after a slow passage. A casual remark could remind the audience that they were not simply hearing records reproduced on stage. They were participating in an evening that seemed to exist only once, even when its elements had been shaped through long habit. The Sands also connected Sinatra to the casino economy and to the older shadows around Las Vegas ownership. The city had grown through a mixture of legal spectacle, tourist money, desert ambition, and associations that often invited scrutiny. Sinatra's own reputation, already marked by rumors of organized crime connections, deepened in this environment. The Chronicle has to move carefully here. Association, friendship, hospitality, and allegation do not all mean the same thing. Sinatra denied mob involvement, and many stories around him grew in the rich soil of rumor. Yet it is also true that the public history of Las Vegas in those years cannot be separated from men whose interests moved through gambling, entertainment, and influence. Sinatra's presence at the Sands placed him near that world, whether one views the nearness as social, professional, or symbolic. The attraction of Las Vegas for Sinatra was not only money, it was control. A film set belonged to directors, producers, studios, and scripts. A record session depended on arrangers, engineers, label schedules, and the permanent judgment of playback. A nightclub room, especially one in which Sinatra had power, could bend more directly around his mood. He could adjust the order of songs, respond to the audience, stretch the banter, shorten a moment, sharpen an edge, or soften the room with a ballad. This kind of control mattered to him. It made performance feel less like employment and more like command. Sammy Davis Jr.'s place in the Rat Pack revealed another layer of the period. Davis was one of the most gifted entertainers of his generation, but he worked inside a country still structured by racial exclusion. Las Vegas itself had a long record of segregation, and black performers often faced barriers in the very hotels and casinos where their talent generated revenue. Sinatra's friendship with Davis and his support for him in some public settings mattered, though it did not dissolve the wider system around them. The image of the Rat Pack as effortless brotherhood can become too simple if it forgets what Davis had to navigate. His presence in that circle was both a sign of changing entertainment culture and a reminder of how much had not changed. The stage banter among the men often carried the marks of its time, including ethnic jokes, gendered assumptions, and racial material that later audiences may hear differently. A sleep chronicle does not need to sharpen those edges, but it should not pretend they were absent. The Rat Pack's comedy belonged to mid-century nightclub culture, with its mixture of charm, cruelty, timing, affection, and social permission. Much of its appeal came from the feeling that the audience had been admitted into a private club. Private clubs, by their nature, also reveal who is allowed to laugh safely and who must work harder inside the laughter. Sinatra's singing at the Sands could still cut through all of this. After the jokes and the glamour and the public mythology, there remained the central fact of the performance. He could hold a song. In a room built for distraction, with drinks moving and casino money waiting beyond the doors, he could make listeners attend to a lyric as though the evening had narrowed to that one line. This was not the loneliness of In the Wee Small Hours exactly, though some of the same authority travelled with him. It was loneliness carried into company, the private mood made public without losing its outline. The Capitol Records and the Vegas shows strengthened each other. The albums gave Sinatra musical seriousness. The showroom gave him social command. A person might listen to the records at home and then go to Las Vegas to see the man who seemed to have stepped out of those arrangements into a living room made of neon, money, and late hours. The studio voice and the stage figure did not perfectly match, because no public figure ever contains himself so neatly, but they fed the same legend. Sinatra as the adult male presence who could move from sorrow to swagger without asking the audience to find the transition strange. Las Vegas also widened his circle of power. Politicians, actors, businessmen, gamblers, journalists, and performers moved through the same social spaces, and Sinatra became a host, connector, and symbol within that movement. He was not merely booked into rooms. He helped define what those rooms meant. A Sinatra appearance could make an evening feel like an event, and a private association with him could feel like access to a larger world. This kind of influence is difficult to measure precisely because it operates through invitations, introductions, gestures, and the memory of who sat at which table. But it was real enough to shape how people spoke about him. Peter Lawford's presence linked the Rat Pack to the Kennedy world. Lawford had married Patricia Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy, and through him Sinatra came closer to the glamour of national politics. This connection would matter greatly in the next phase of his life, but in the Vegas years it already added another layer to the circle. The Rat Pack was not only a nightclub grouping, it became a meeting point between entertainment, politics, wealth, and image. In mid-century America, those realms were learning to use one another more openly, and Sinatra stood close to the exchange. The films associated with the Rat Pack, including Ocean's 11, helped export the group's image beyond those who could enter the Copa Room. The film presented them within a stylish world of camaraderie, risk, and controlled mischief, allowing audiences to consume a version of the Vegas circle without actually being there. It did not matter that the fiction was lighter than the realities around it. The image had its own work to do. It turned friendship into product, leisure into mythology, and Las Vegas into a place where adult men seemed to live by codes of loyalty, jokes, suits, songs, and luck. Behind the mythology, Sinatra's own working standards remained high. He might cultivate ease, but he did not admire sloppiness in performance. Musicians who worked with him knew that he cared about tempo, phrasing, and the placement of a song inside the evening. The room could feel relaxed because the work behind the relaxation was exact. This had been true since Dorsey refined at Capitol and made theatrical in Vegas. Sinatra's authority depended on the audience believing he could do almost anything casually, while the professionals around him understood how carefully the casualness had to be maintained. Yet the same environment that magnified him could also intensify his worst habits. Vegas rewarded command, loyalty, appetite, and public dominance. It did not always reward patience, restraint, or gentleness. Sinatra's temper, his need for control, and his attraction to powerful men found room to grow there. The city offered admiration on a nightly basis, but admiration given nightly can become less like gratitude and more like atmosphere. For a man who had already survived public loss, the return of such steady attention must have felt both vindicating and dangerous. The Sands years fixed one of the most durable images of Sinatra in public memory. For many listeners, he remains there still, tuxedoed, dryly amused, standing before a band in a room where midnight seems less like an hour than a condition. But history has to keep the image moving. The man at the Copper Room was not separate from the boy in Hoboken, the apprentice with Dorsey, the fallen Columbia idol, or the Oscar-winning actor. He was all of them carried forward, now arranged under brighter lights and surrounded by men who helped make his authority look effortless. Las Vegas gave Sinatra a kingdom of performance, but kingdoms of performance are never sealed off from the world beyond their doors. The same circle that brought him laughter, loyalty, and glamour also brought him closer to politics, rumor, and forms of power that could not be managed like a song list. Through Lawford, through campaign friendships, through Palm Springs hospitality, and through the national desire to see glamour near government, Sinatra's stage world began to lean toward Washington. The next room would not be a showroom, though it would have its own rituals, its own audience, and its own careful arrangements of access. It would be the room of presidents, invitations, and the painful discovery that political friendship could be withdrawn more coldly than applause. Chapter 9. Presidents, Rumors, and Broken Invitations. John F. Kennedy entered Frank Sinatra's world through glamour before he entered it through disappointment. The connection seemed, for a time, almost perfectly arranged for the early 1960s, when politics had begun to understand the uses of celebrity, and celebrity had begun to understand the uses of politics. Sinatra had already become more than a singer. He was a host, a connector, a man of rooms, a figure whose table could gather actors, entertainers, businessmen, journalists, and people who wished to be near power even before they knew what that nearness might cost. Kennedy, younger than most national politicians who had carried the public imagination so easily, seemed to belong naturally inside that bright social current. The relationship was helped by Peter Lawford, who stood at the crossing point between the Rat Pack and the Kennedy family. Lawford had married Patricia Kennedy, and his position made him useful in a world where personal access could carry nearly as much weight as public endorsement. Through Lawford, Sinatra's circle and Kennedy's circle came close enough for each to benefit from the other's light. The singer brought star power, entertainment connections, and a public image of adult command. Kennedy brought the promise of political youth, national glamour, and the possibility that the old separation between Washington and show business might be softened into something more modern. The 1960 presidential campaign gave that connection a practical setting. Sinatra supported Kennedy with energy, lending his name, his circle, and his ability to gather attention. Performers could do what campaign staff could not always do. They could make politics feel social, stylish, and emotionally charged without requiring speeches to carry all the work. Sinatra helped organize and participate in events where entertainment and politics met in the same room, and the effect suited Kennedy's public image. The candidate appeared not only serious and ambitious, but current. In a television age still finding its full political language, that mattered. Sinatra's own motives were not merely decorative. He had long been interested in politics, and his mother's old Hoboken world of ward influence and democratic loyalties had given him an early sense that public life was built through relationships as much as through ideals. Supporting Kennedy allowed him to stand near the future rather than merely perform for it. For a man who had fought his way from local obscurity to national command, political access must have seemed like another room that could be entered through force of personality, loyalty, and usefulness. He had learned in entertainment that doors opened for those who could fill them with value. It was natural enough that he thought politics might work the same way. Kennedy's campaign also benefited from the feeling that American public life was becoming less stiff. Sinatra and his circle made politics appear less distant from popular culture. Songs, appearances, friendships, and photographs could suggest a candidate surrounded by vitality rather than ceremony alone. The older image of political authority as grey, formal, and remote did not vanish, but Kennedy's campaign weakened it. Sinatra's participation belonged to that transformation. He was not the cause of it, but he was one of the figures through whom it became visible. Around this connection gathered other names, and with them came the difficulties that would later weigh heavily on Sinatra's public reputation. Joseph P. Kennedy, the candidate's father, understood power in practical terms, and the wider Kennedy campaign operated in a world where votes, unions, city machines, Catholic networks, and local influence all mattered. Sinatra's own circle included people whose reputations drew federal attention, including figures associated in public reporting and law enforcement interest with organized crime. Sam Giancana's name became part of this shadowed history. So did later claims and accounts involving Judith Campbell Exner, whose connections to both Kennedy and Giancana became part of the tangled afterlife of the period. The record around these matters must be handled carefully. Association is not proof of command, rumor is not documentation, and later testimony can carry its own uncertainties. Sinatra denied mob involvement, and the existence of acquaintances or social proximity does not by itself settle the question of what influence moved through which channel. Yet history cannot ignore the fact that federal investigators, journalists, biographers, and political observers all treated these associations as consequential. Sinatra's fame made every connection larger. A photograph, a dinner, a favor, an introduction, or a guest list could become part of a public pattern, even when the private meaning of the event remained less clear. Sinatra's FBI file became one of the formal traces of that scrutiny. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau collected information on him across many years, including allegations, reports, and observations tied to his friendships, politics, behavior, and public influence. An FBI file is not the same thing as a verdict. It gathers suspicion as well as fact, rumor as well as report, and sometimes the anxieties of the institution doing the watching. Still, the existence of that file shows how thoroughly Sinatra had moved beyond ordinary entertainment celebrity. He was now a person whose social world was considered politically and legally interesting. The Kennedy connection reached its most painful symbolic break in 1962, when President Kennedy traveled to California and did not stay at Sinatra's Palm Springs home. Sinatra had reportedly made preparations with great care, expecting to host the president in a house adjusted for the visit. The cancellation, and Kennedy's decision to stay instead at Bing Crosby's home, carried a humiliation far beyond ordinary scheduling. Crosby, the older singer whom Sinatra had admired as a young man, became an unwilling figure in the insult. To be passed over in favor of Crosby, after preparing to receive the president, turned a political distancing into something almost personally theatrical. The reasons for the break lay partly in political caution. Kennedy's advisors were increasingly concerned about Sinatra's associations and the public risk of being seen too close to him. The presidency required different calculations from the campaign. A candidate might welcome celebrity heat. A president had to consider federal scrutiny, newspaper interpretation, and the dangers of symbolic intimacy. Sinatra, accustomed to loyalty as a personal code, experienced this kind of calculation differently. To him, it could look like betrayal. To the White House, it could look like necessary distance. This was one of the moments when Sinatra discovered that political friendship did not obey the same rules as nightclub loyalty. In his own world, favors, appearances, private hospitality, and personal allegiance carried emotional weight. A man who helped another man expected the help to be remembered. Politics could remember and still withdraw. Its gratitude was conditional, often silent, and sometimes sacrificed to appearance. The hurt for Sinatra lay not only in being rejected, but in being reminded that even his power had limits outside the rooms he controlled. Lawford suffered in Sinatra's circle because of the rupture. The cooling between Sinatra and Kennedy damaged Lawford's standing with the group, and the old Rat Pack ease became harder to sustain. This, too, reveals how personal the whole arrangement had been. Political access had entered through family connection and friendship, not through formal office. When the connection failed, the injury traveled through the same private channels that had once carried the advantage. Sinatra's world was built on loyalty, but loyalty in such circles could become severe when someone was thought to have failed in his usefulness. Sinatra's political life did not end with Kennedy. In later years, he moved toward Republican figures, supported Ronald Reagan, and became associated with a different political mood from the democratic world of his mother and early adulthood. That shift belonged partly to age, partly to personal grievance, partly to changing national politics, and partly to Sinatra's own complex sense of order, patriotism, resentment, and recognition. The Kennedy disappointment did not explain everything that followed, but it marked a significant emotional break. A man who had helped make the youthful democratic glamour of 1960 feel musical and modern later stood warmly beside a Republican president who came from Hollywood and understood performance in politics from the inside. The broader historical change was larger than Sinatra. American politics was becoming more image-conscious, more dependent on television, more willing to borrow from entertainment, and more vulnerable to the private lives of public friends. Kennedy's presidency helped accelerate that movement, and Sinatra's proximity to it shows how early the pattern was already forming. Later generations would become accustomed to entertainers campaigning for candidates, presidents appearing with actors and singers, and political identity being shaped through cultural taste. In 1960, the arrangement still carried a fresh charge. Sinatra was part of that freshness, and also part of the warning attached to it. The mob allegations, the Kennedy rupture, and the FBI attention did not stop Sinatra's career. They became part of the atmosphere around him, sometimes thickening the legend, sometimes darkening it, sometimes giving hostile observers material they could return to again and again. For some admirers, the rumors added danger to his glamour. For critics, they confirmed suspicions about arrogance, influence, and hidden worlds around show business. For historians, they remain a difficult layer of evidence, suggestion, denial, and cultural fascination. Sinatra's life had become large enough that even uncertainty around him acquired historical weight. His music from these years did not always directly reflect the political turmoil, but the public figure singing the songs had changed. The man who stood before audiences in the early 1960s was not only the Capitol interpreter or the Sands commander. He was now someone who had been close to presidential power and then kept outside its door. That experience added another line to the long education in rise, loss, and recovery that had shaped him since the late 1940s. He had lost audiences before. He had lost a marriage. He had nearly lost his career. Now he had lost access to a world that had seemed briefly to confirm his importance beyond entertainment. The loss did not make him smaller in show business. If anything, it deepened the sense that Sinatra existed near the places where American power revealed its private arrangements. He could sing a saloon song, act in a film, joke in a casino, campaign for a president, anger federal officials, and appear in rumors that crossed from gossip columns into official files. Few entertainers of his generation carried so many forms of attention at once. This was not always a blessing. Attention multiplies the self until no single version can govern all the others. Kennedy's assassination in 1963 changed the national memory of that whole political world. The glamour of the early 1960s became shadowed by grief, conspiracy, and retrospective scrutiny. People looked back at friendships, phone calls, guest lists, campaign alliances, and private movements with new intensity. Sinatra's place near the Kennedy Circle became part of that backward searching. What had once seemed stylish could later seem ominous. What had once seemed socially useful could be reread as evidence of risk. The dead president's image hardened into myth, and everyone who had stood near him was drawn in some way into that myth's outer light. Sinatra continued working, recording, performing, and expanding his control over his own career. The Kennedy years did not define him completely, but they clarified one of the central patterns of his life. He wanted access, and when access was given, he treated it with the intensity of possession. When it was withdrawn, the injury lingered. He had built a career by making rooms turn toward him, yet there were rooms that could still close without apology. That knowledge did not calm him. It moved him toward other forms of independence. The next form would be institutional. If record companies, studios, hotels, and political circles all placed limits on him, Sinatra would create a structure carrying his own authority more directly. He had already learned from Capitol what the right recording environment could do, and he had learned from Las Vegas how powerful a room could become when it bent around his presence. Now he would try to own more of the frame itself through a record label named not for a corporation's history, but for the return of a song, a performance, and a man who did not like being told where the evening ended. Chapter 10. Reprise and the Desire to Own the Room. Reprise Records grew out of Frank Sinatra's need for control, and by the early 1960s, that need had become one of the clearest patterns in his public life. He had learned what it meant to be framed by other people's institutions. Tommy Dorsey had given him discipline, but Dorsey's orchestra had also reminded him that a singer could be held inside a bandleader's name. Columbia had made him a solo idol, but Columbia had also belonged to the younger, softer version of himself that the public eventually left behind. Capitol had restored him more magnificently than any label before it, yet even there, surrounded by Nelson Riddle, Gordon Jenkins, Billy May, and some of the finest musicians in American recording, Sinatra remained a performer working inside a company he did not own. The decision to found Reprise was therefore not a sudden business curiosity. It followed naturally from the life that had come before it. Sinatra had grown up in a household where Dolly Sinatra understood the value of influence, favors, and personal authority. He had come through band contracts that made freedom expensive. He had seen Hollywood give, withdraw, and restore respect according to calculations that did not always feel just. In Las Vegas, he had felt the power of a room that bent around him. And in politics, he had discovered the humiliation of rooms that could close without explanation. Reprise offered a different answer. If the existing frame limited him, he would build one that bore his own mark. The label was founded in 1960, and its very name carried the idea of return. A reprise is a musical return, a passage heard again with changed meaning, and the words suited a man whose career had already depended on reappearance. Sinatra had returned from decline through From Here to Eternity. He had returned to musical authority through Capitol. Now he wanted return to become structure rather than accident. Reprise would give artists more freedom than the standard label arrangement often allowed, including in its original spirit, greater control over masters and recording choices. For Sinatra, the business idea was also a statement of temperament. The artist should not always have to ask permission from the house. His first Reprise album, Ring-a-Ding-Ding, announced the new enterprise with confidence rather than caution. The title itself belonged to the bright, swinging language of early 1960s Sinatra, full of motion, wit, and surface ease. Johnny Mandel arranged the album, and the sound leaned into the lively side of Sinatra's authority. It did not ask the listener to think of the fallen singer, the wounded lover, or the man standing outside presidential doors. It presented command as fact. A new label needed exactly that kind of opening, not because it explained the business model, but because it made the business model audible. Reprise began with Sinatra sounding as though he had entered a room he owned. Ownership, however, is never only romance. A record label requires money, contracts, schedules, promotion, distribution, relationships with artists, and the tedious practicalities that sit behind every elegant logo, Sinatra could provide fame, vision, and magnetic force. But he was not alone in making the company operate. Executives, producers, arrangers, and staff had to turn the idea into releases that could survive beyond the excitement of the founder's name. This is one reason artist-owned structures are often more complicated than they appear from the outside. Freedom has to be administered, and administration has a way of pulling even the freest gesture back toward ordinary paperwork. Reprise attracted other artists, and Sinatra's stature helped make the label feel like more than a vanity project. Dean Martin recorded for Reprise, as did Sammy Davis Jr., and the label's identity became connected to Sinatra's circle as well as to his personal catalogue. There was something fitting in this. The man who had helped turn Las Vegas friendship into public entertainment now tried to gather artists under a company shaped by his own authority. Yet the label could not exist only as an extension of camaraderie. It had to stand in the marketplace, where affection, loyalty, and glamour mattered less than sales, distribution, and the changing appetite of listeners. The music market of the early 1960s was already shifting beneath him. Rock and roll had altered the soundscape in the previous decade, and youth culture was becoming a more powerful commercial force. Sinatra remained immense, but the center of popular music was no longer arranged around singers like him with the same certainty. The adult audience still existed, and it was large, but the industry's sense of momentum had begun to tilt toward younger sounds, younger bodies, and younger forms of rebellion. Reprise was founded by a master of one era at the edge of another. That gave it dignity, but also difficulty. Sinatra's own recordings for Reprise showed both continuity and adjustment. He still worked with major arrangers, still chose standards, still swung with precision, and still entered ballads with the knowledge gained during the Capitol years. Yet the Reprise catalogue did not simply repeat Capitol's achievement. No artist can return to the same river with the same face. The mood of the country was changing, the recording industry was changing, and Sinatra himself carried a different kind of authority. Capitol had given him the sound of artistic restoration. Reprise gave him the sound of self-possession, sometimes brilliant, sometimes uneven, often fascinating because the man behind it had become impossible to separate from the institution. Television became another important room for this phase of his career. Sinatra had appeared on television before, but the early 1960s made the medium increasingly central to American public life. The television special allowed him to combine music, guest appearances, controlled staging, and national reach in a form that sat between concert, variety show, and private invitation. The small screen did not offer the same intimacy as a nightclub, nor the same permanence as a record, but it entered the home directly. For a performer whose art had long depended on the illusion of closeness, television was both useful and demanding. It placed the face, not only the voice, under sustained attention. Sinatra understood image, though he did not always submit easily to the machinery that managed it. His suits, stance, gestures, and stage arrangements belonged to a carefully legible public self. The loosened tie, the hat, the glass, the hand near the microphone, the slight lean into a phrase, these details became part of the grammar of his authority. In the Reprise and television years, that grammar traveled across records, films, broadcasts, and live appearances. The audience did not need to see the whole performance to recognize the type. A few signs were enough, because Sinatra had become one of the most readable figures in American entertainment. Film continued alongside the music and television work, though not always at the level of his greatest acting success. He appeared in serious dramas, lighter vehicles, war films, and Rat Pack productions, moving through Hollywood with the status of a star whose presence could carry a project even when the material was uneven. The Manchurian Candidate in 1962 gave him one of his strongest later screen roles, placing him inside a political thriller whose mood of anxiety matched the Cold War atmosphere around it. The film showed again that Sinatra could be effective when directors used his tension rather than merely his glamour. His best acting often came when the role allowed pressure to show through the polish. That same year, the broader public world around him remained marked by politics, suspicion, and access. The Kennedy rupture had not erased his political interest, and his social world still drew attention from journalists and investigators. Reprise did not remove him from those complications. It added another layer to the figure he had become. Not only singer, actor, host, and political friend, but label head. This accumulation of identities could make him seem larger than any single profession. It also made him difficult to judge simply. The same man could produce an exquisite vocal performance, offer decisive support to another artist, rage against a perceived slight, cultivate political friendship, and carry rumors that neither admiration nor denial could completely dissolve. The sale of Reprise to Warner Bros. In 1963 changed the label's independent shape, though Sinatra remained closely associated with it. The sale was practical because distribution and financial pressure made full independence difficult to sustain. Artist control had met the weight of the industry. Warner's acquisition did not make the Reprise idea meaningless. It revealed the cost of keeping such an idea alive at commercial scale. Sinatra had wanted a house of his own, but even a house built by a powerful artist needed roads, suppliers, accountants, and protection from storms larger than one man's will. The Warner connection also placed Sinatra inside a broader corporate structure at a time when entertainment companies were learning how to manage catalogs, stars, film, television, and records across related systems. The older world of separate show business territories was becoming more integrated. A performer could be a recording artist, actor, television figure, nightclub attraction, and business asset all at once. Sinatra had already lived that integration personally. Now the institutions around him were beginning to catch up with the shape of his career. Artist ownership would become a much more familiar subject in later decades as musicians fought for masters, publishing rights, label freedom, and control over release schedules. Sinatra's Reprise experiment belongs early in that longer history. It did not solve the problem permanently, and it did not prevent compromise, but it showed that a major performer could imagine the record label not as a distant authority, but as an extension of artistic power. This is one of the quieter reasons the episode matters beyond Sinatra alone. His desire for control anticipated arguments that later artists would make in different language, under different contracts, and in very different musical worlds. Inside the studio, the work continued to depend on listening rather than ownership. A label could carry his name, but a record still lived or failed by arrangement, tempo, phrasing, and the mysterious final balance between singer and song. Sinatra's authority did not exempt him from the discipline of performance. If anything, it made that discipline more necessary. The more powerful he became outside the booth, the more important it was that the singing remain exact inside it. Otherwise, the institution would become louder than the art. The Reprise years also revealed the challenge of being both artist and monument while still alive. Sinatra was not finished, but he was already historical. Younger performers were reshaping popular music, and audiences who had grown up with him now heard him not only as a current singer but as a bearer of memory. That position can be valuable, but it can also harden around a performer. The public begins to want the known signs, the familiar gestures, the songs that confirm the legend. Sinatra still sought freshness, but he also understood the power of giving people the figure they had come to see. His television specials and concerts often worked within that balance. They offered new settings and guests, but they also renewed the established Sinatra presence, the orchestra, the formal dress, the mixture of swing and ballad, the brief spoken ease between songs, and the final sense of a man holding the evening together all returned in recognizable form. Repetition, when handled carefully, can become ritual rather than fatigue. Sinatra's task was to keep the ritual alive without letting it become waxwork. At his best, he made the familiar feel freshly inhabited. Reprise did not free him from time. Nothing could. The label gave him ownership, but not youth, authority, but not immunity from changing taste, a structure of control, but not control over the culture's direction. The 1960s would continue moving into sounds and social energies far from the world that had made him. The Beatles, Motown, folk rock, protest music, and later psychedelic forms would alter the public ear. Sinatra could remain important, but he could no longer assume that importance and centrality were the same thing. This distinction would become more visible as the decade deepened. For the moment, though, he had done something few entertainers manage after a major comeback. He had converted restored fame into institutional power. He had moved from being the man hired to sing into the man whose name appeared on the label. That movement did not erase dependence, compromise, or commercial pressure, but it marked a real change in scale. Sinatra had learned that a room could be borrowed, commanded, lost, or closed against him. Reprise was his attempt to make one room more permanently his own. The years ahead would test whether even that was enough. Marriage, age, younger music, fatigue, and the strange burden of being Frank Sinatra in a world that kept changing around him would press against the confidence he had built. He would withdraw, return, adjust, and stand before audiences who no longer heard him as a new sound but as a living emblem of an older one. The label had given him a house, but the weather outside was shifting, and the next part of the story would unfold in the changed air of the late 1960s and early 1970s, where even a man who had mastered return would have to decide what it meant to step away. Chapter 11: Retirement, Return, and the Changed Air. The late 1960s placed Frank Sinatra in a country that no longer moved naturally around the kind of authority he represented. He remained famous, wealthy, admired, and powerful. But fame does not always mean centrality. The public ear had widened toward rock, soul, folk, protest songs, electric guitars, youth festivals, and studio experiments that did not ask permission from the older grammar of tuxedos, orchestras, nightclubs, and carefully balanced standards. Sinatra had survived changes before. He had moved from Hoboken rooms to amateur radio, from big bands to solo hysteria, from Collapse to Oscar, from Capitol albums to Las Vegas Command. Yet this change felt different because it was not merely a change in taste, it was a change in generational atmosphere. The young audiences of the late 1960s were not waiting for a singer to lean into a microphone and phrase a lyric with elegant restraint. Many of them wanted volume, rupture, collective feeling, and the sense that music could speak against the inherited order rather than refine it. Sinatra did not belong to that rebellion, and he did not pretend to. His art had been built through discipline, arrangement, timing, and the adult management of emotion. The new music often valued a different kind of truth, one closer to raw declaration, studio invention, or communal unrest. A performer can admire change, resist it, misunderstand it, or outlast it, but he cannot keep it from arriving. Sinatra's personal life during these years also carried instability and reinvention. His marriage to Mia Farrow in 1966 had surprised many people, partly because of the difference in age and partly because Farrow belonged to a younger Hollywood world. She was associated with a softer, more modern image, especially through Peyton Place and then through the cultural attention that gathered around her. Their marriage placed Sinatra beside a generation he did not quite inhabit. It was brief, strained by professional demands and differences in temperament, and ended in divorce in 1968. The private matter should not be made to carry more meaning than it can bear, but it did echo a larger historical tension. Sinatra was trying to live, work, and remain powerful in a culture that was becoming less arranged around men like him. His records in this period show a performer negotiating that shift without surrendering his central identity. He could still record standards, still command a ballad, still swing with musicians who understood his phrasing, but the marketplace around him had become less predictable. Some attempts to connect with newer material worked better than others. Strangers in the Night, released in 1966, gave him a major hit, though Sinatra himself was not always affectionate toward the song. Its success mattered because it proved that the public could still gather around his voice in the middle of a changing decade. Yet even a hit could not stop the wider movement of popular music away from his natural territory. My Way arrived near the end of that decade and became attached to him with a force that would shape the rest of his public life. The song, adapted into English lyrics by Paul Anka from a French original, offered a statement of self-reckoning that audiences came to hear as autobiography. Sinatra's relationship with it was more complicated than the public's attachment suggested, but the song carried exactly the sort of grand personal summary that people wanted from him. It allowed listeners to place his career inside a single declarative shape: pride, regret, endurance, and self-possession. Songs can become public monuments even when the singer's private feeling toward them remains mixed. The success of My Way did not remove his fatigue. Years of recording, touring, filming, public scrutiny, political entanglement, and personal volatility had accumulated around him. The stage had been his territory for so long that stepping away from it could seem almost unnatural. Yet the desire to withdraw grew stronger. Retirement, for a performer like Sinatra, was not only a professional decision, it was a test of identity. If a man has spent decades arranging rooms around his presence, the silence after leaving those rooms is not empty in any simple way. It carries memory, relief, uncertainty, and the question of whether the public will wait. In 1971, Sinatra announced his retirement and gave a farewell concert in Los Angeles. The event carried the solemnity of a public ending. Though endings in entertainment often remain provisional, he was in his mid-50s. Not old by ordinary measures, but old enough in the machinery of popular music to feel the pressure of replacement. The retirement allowed the public to honor him as a figure whose life had already become historical. It also allowed Sinatra to step away before the culture could make the decision for him. There is a difference between leaving and being left behind, and Sinatra understood that difference too sharply to ignore it. The farewell concert gathered many of the strands of his public identity. There was the orchestra, the formal clothing, the careful sequence of songs, the applause shaped by memory as much as by the evening itself. An audience at such a performance does not hear only what is sung. It hears the earlier records, the old films, the Las Vegas nights, the comeback, the scandals, the friendships, the rooms that can no longer be entered. Sinatra stood before people who knew they were being asked to witness a closing, and he had spent his whole life understanding how strongly a room responds when it believes an emotion has been made official. Yet retirement did not settle him. The habits of work, command, and public exchange had formed too much of his being. Away from the regular demands of performance, he did not become a different man so much as a man without his most reliable instrument of order. A stage gave him structure. A recording session gave him a task. An audience gave him a measure of reality. Without those things, withdrawal could turn less restful than expected. For some artists, retirement opens a quieter life. For Sinatra, it appears to have revealed how deeply his sense of self remained tied to the act of returning. The return came in 1973 with Old Blue Eyes Is Back, a title that announced what the public already understood the event to be. The phrase drew on one of his familiar nicknames, but it also carried a larger promise. The man who had left had not dissolved into memory. He could still be seen, heard, introduced, applauded, and placed before an orchestra. The accompanying television special helped restore him to national visibility in the manner suited to his later career. He was not returning as a new artist and did not need to. He was returning as Frank Sinatra, which by then was a role, a reputation, a body of work, and a demand placed upon the man himself. The voice that returned was older. It had lost some of the smoothness and flexibility of the prime Capitol years, and careful listeners could hear the difference. But loss inside a voice does not always mean artistic emptiness. An older voice can carry authority through texture rather than ease. Sinatra's later singing, at its best, made age audible without apologizing for it. He could no longer always float the phrase as he once had, but he could still make a lyric arrive with placement, memory, and command. The weakened places in the instrument sometimes revealed the life behind it more plainly than the old polish had done. Audiences responded not only to the sound, but to the fact of his presence. The culture had changed so much by the early 1970s that Sinatra's return gave many listeners a way of touching a previous musical order. He became, increasingly, a living archive. That phrase does not mean he was frozen. He still worked, chose material, toured, and appeared in new contexts. But the public approached him with accumulated memory. They came to hear the man who had been young during the war, who had fallen in the early 1950s, who had made the Capitol albums, who had ruled Las Vegas rooms, who had stood near presidents, and who now stood before them older, still upright, still phrasing. The concert stage of the 1970s was different from the nightclub rooms that had helped form him. Larger venues, altered sound systems, and changing audience expectations required adjustment. A Copa Room performance could create the feeling of social proximity. An arena required projection of presence across a broader field. Sinatra's strength lay in making even a large room feel governed by his timing. He did not become a rock performer, and he did not need to borrow that kind of energy. He brought the older command into newer spaces, with orchestras, arrangements, and the formal codes that had become inseparable from his identity. Political life also shifted around him. His movement toward Republican figures, especially Ronald Reagan, became more visible. Reagan, like Sinatra, had moved from entertainment into another form of public authority, and their friendship belonged partly to a shared understanding of performance, loyalty, patriotism, and the uses of image. Sinatra's earlier democratic world had not entirely vanished from his biography, but the emotional and political path of his later years had moved elsewhere. The Kennedy disappointment, the cultural unrest of the 1960s, and his own temperament all played their parts. His politics, like his career, did not remain fixed in the shape of his youth. The return years did not erase the volatility around him. Stories of temper, loyalty, generosity, control, and grievance continued. Sinatra remained capable of great kindness and sharp cruelty, of support for friends and fury toward those he believed had crossed him. The public often prefers aging legends to become gentle, but history rarely obliges such preferences. The older Sinatra was still recognizably the man formed by Hoboken pride, show business pressure, public adoration, and private injury. Age changed his voice and pace. It did not dissolve his contradictions. Musically, the 1970s positioned him between active performer and cultural monument. He recorded, toured, and appeared on television, but each act now carried a backward shadow. A new Sinatra album could not be heard in the same way as a new album by a young artist. It entered a catalogue already heavy with masterpieces and memory. That weight could be both protection and burden. The public was willing to listen because of what he had been. The work had to survive comparison with what he had been. Few artists can compete with their own earlier selves for long without feeling the strain. Still, the late performances had their own purpose. They allowed Sinatra to continue the public conversation with his audience, rather than accept that the conversation had ended in 1971. The songs changed meaning as he aged. A lyric about regret, endurance, departure, or pride sounded different from a man who had already lived through several public lives. Even familiar material could gather new weight because the singer's body had become part of the interpretation. The breath was older, the timing sometimes rougher, the command more effortful. But the accumulated identity behind the phrase could make the song land with a force younger perfection might not possess. The notion of relevance became less useful for understanding him. Relevance often belongs to the present moment, to what feels new, urgent, or fashionable. Presence is different. Sinatra's later career depended more on presence than relevance. He no longer needed to define the whole direction of popular music in order to matter. He mattered because he remained one of the figures through whom listeners understood where American popular singing had been, and how much emotional intelligence could live inside phrasing, arrangement, and restraint. A culture can move on from an artist's central style and still keep returning to the artist as a measure. The retirement and return also strengthened one of the oldest patterns in his career. Sinatra was repeatedly declared finished, diminished, outdated, compromised, or past the point of return. Each time he found some way to re-enter the public room, though never as the same man. After the bobby-soxer years, he returned through film and capital. After cultural change and fatigue, he returned through the older authority of his own name. The returns were not identical, and they were not all equally triumphant. Their deeper meaning lies in adaptation rather than victory. Sinatra survived by allowing the public to meet a revised version of him while still recognizing the earlier one inside it. By the end of the 1970s, the man who had once feared being left behind had become almost impossible to remove from the cultural landscape. He was no longer the future of American music. but he was part of its structure. Younger listeners might know him through parents, television, tribute, imitation, or the unavoidable presence of certain songs in public life. Older listeners carried more intimate memories. Between those groups stood Sinatra himself, still working, still demanding attention, still testing how much time would yield and how much it would refuse. The changed air had not defeated him, but it had altered the terms of his power. He could no longer depend on novelty, youth, or cultural centrality. He depended instead on recognition, memory, craft, and the strange authority of a man who had already become a symbol while continuing to perform as a working singer. The next stage would make that symbolism even stronger. Certain songs would harden into signatures, especially the ones audiences used to explain him to themselves. They would not contain the whole man, because no song could do that. But they would follow him into arenas, ceremonies, late tours, and the long public twilight where a voice, no longer young, could still make a crowd rise before the final note had fully left the room. Chapter 12. My Way, New York, and the Late Signature. The songs that followed Frank Sinatra into his later years did not behave like ordinary entries in a catalogue. Some of them became almost public emblems, carried into banquets, arenas, television tributes, political gatherings, retirement ceremonies, and private evenings where listeners wanted the large shape of a life to fit inside a few minutes of music. This was especially true of My Way, a song that attached itself to Sinatra so firmly that many listeners came to hear it less as a recording than as a declaration. The attachment was powerful, but also misleading if taken too simply. Sinatra's life was too changeable, too restless, and too contradictory to be reduced to one song, even one that seemed to speak with his posture and his defiance. The song had not begun as an American statement of individual pride. Its melody came from the French song Comme d'habitude, written by Claude François and Jacques Revaux, with lyrics by Claude François and Gilles Thibault. Paul Anka heard the song, acquired the rights for English adaptation, and wrote new lyrics with Sinatra in mind. The result was not a translation so much as a transformation. The French original carried a different emotional world centered on routine and fading love. Anka's English lyric turned the melody toward self-accounting, toward the image of a man near the end of a road looking back with regret, firmness, and refusal to be ashamed. Sinatra recorded My Way in 1968, and the record appeared in 1969. Just as the old order of American popular music seemed very far from the center of youth culture. The song did not try to sound young. It did not borrow the language of rock, protest, or psychedelic experiment. It stood in formal dress, so to speak, facing an audience that understood the gesture immediately. The arrangement gave the lyric room to grow from recollection into assertion, and Sinatra's performance carried the weight of someone whom the public already knew as a survivor. Listeners could attach the song to the whole story. Hoboken, the Bobby-Soxers, the Fall, the Oscar, Capitol, Vegas, Kennedy, Reprise, Retirement, Return. That attachment became stronger than Sinatra's own reported feeling for the song. He did not always enjoy performing it, and he sometimes spoke of it with impatience. Yet audiences wanted it, and the demand became part of the late career contract between singer and public. The signature song can become a gift and a confinement at the same time. It gives the audience a doorway into memory, but it also asks the performer to stand in the same doorway again and again. Sinatra knew the usefulness of the song, but he also knew the danger of being explained too neatly by it. The performance worked because he did not sing it like a young man pretending to look back. The grain of age and experience was already present. His voice in the late 1960s was still strong, but it no longer carried the seamless freshness of the early Capitol period. That difference served the song. The lyric needed a body behind it, a career behind it, a history of wounds and recoveries behind it. In a younger voice, the words might have sounded theatrical. In Sinatra's voice, they sounded like theater strengthened by biography. The audience did not need every line to match the facts. It needed the general authority of a man who had stood in public long enough to make the final stance believable. My Way also suited a broader cultural appetite. The late 20th century loved stories of self-invention, and Sinatra's life offered one in unusually concentrated form. He had been born into an immigrant working-class household, made himself through sound and will, lost nearly everything that mattered professionally, returned with greater authority, and entered rooms of money, politics, and entertainment power that would have seemed unreachable from early Hoboken. The song's proud individualism allowed listeners to hear that rise without dwelling too long on the compromises, dependencies, collaborators, and accidents that also shaped it. The myth of the solitary self is often most persuasive when a crowd has helped build it. Another late signature arrived through Theme from New York, New York, though it belonged to a different emotional register. The song came from the 1977 Martin Scorsese film New York, New York, where Liza Minnelli introduced it, and Sinatra recorded his own version in 1979. His recording gradually became one of the city's unofficial anthems, a song heard at celebrations, public events, and especially in the ritual life of New York sports. It gave Sinatra a late association, not with farewell, but with arrival. If My Way looked back, New York, New York looked upward and outward, toward ambition, city lights, and the stubborn belief that a person might still begin again. The connection between Sinatra and New York had always been more complicated than a simple civic anthem. He was born in Hoboken, across the Hudson, close enough to Manhattan for its power to feel immediate and distant at once. His early career had depended on New York radio, theaters, record companies, and the Paramount crowds. He had crossed from New Jersey into the city's entertainment machinery long before the song made that geography symbolic. When he sang of New York later in life, the line between literal place and career mythology grew thin. The city stood for the world he had once tried to enter, and for the public scale he eventually commanded. The recording of New York, New York also showed how a late Sinatra performance could rely on force of identity as much as vocal finish. The voice was older, broader, sometimes rougher at the edges, but the phrasing still carried command. He did not need to sound like the young man who had studied Dorsey's Breath or the capital singer who could float a line through midnight sadness. He needed to sound like the figure audiences already understood him to be: durable, formal, defiant, slightly grand, and tied to the older idea that a song could still stand at the center of public ceremony. The record did exactly that. These late signatures followed him into tours where audiences increasingly came not only to hear music, but to witness survival. Concerts in the 1970s and 1980s often placed Sinatra before listeners who carried different layers of memory. Some remembered the wartime radio voice, others remembered the Capitol albums, others had come to him through Las Vegas, films, television, parents' records, or the unavoidable presence of My Way in public life. A Sinatra concert became a gathering of eras. The man on stage held them together, sometimes effortlessly, sometimes through visible labor, but always through recognition. Large venues changed the relationship between Sinatra and the audience. Earlier in his career, a nightclub or theater could preserve a sense of nearness. Later, arenas and concert halls required a broader projection of presence, especially as age altered the voice. Sound systems carried him farther than his body could, and orchestras helped preserve the scale of the old arrangements. The microphone remained essential, not as a novelty now, but as a lifelong partner. It had once allowed Crosby and Sinatra to make intimacy modern. In old age, it allowed Sinatra to keep intimacy possible, even when the room had grown too large for natural closeness. The duets projects of the 1990s extended this late public life into a new recording format. Sinatra recorded his parts separately, while other performers added theirs, creating the impression of shared performances across studio distance. The albums were commercially successful and introduced him again to listeners who knew the guest artists more immediately than they knew the Capitol catalog. They were not intimate collaborations in the older sense of musicians gathered together around the same musical breath, but they were revealing as late career artifacts. Technology allowed Sinatra's voice to be placed beside newer stars, and the arrangement turned him into both participant and monument. Those recordings raised questions about presence, age, and the preservation of legacy. Some listeners welcomed the chance to hear Sinatra framed by contemporary names. Others preferred the older records, where the musicians and singer moved inside one shared moment of arrangement and take. Both reactions make sense. The duets albums belong to a different entertainment economy, one built around event, brand, cross-generational recognition, and the ability of recording technology to join performances that did not unfold together in the room. Sinatra had spent his life inside changing media, from radio to records to film to television to late studio engineering. The duets projects were another sign that the machinery had kept moving around him. His late concerts could be uneven, as late concerts often are when an artist has been working for half a century. Memory can be more forgiving than the present sound. Some evenings carried flashes of old authority, the line placed with unmistakable intelligence, the phrase still delayed in a way no imitator could quite manage. Other evenings revealed fatigue, dependence on monitors, or the natural narrowing of the voice with age. Yet even those limitations formed part of the historical truth. Sinatra had not become a preserved recording. He was a working body in time, and time had left marks that no arrangement could fully hide. The audience often responded to those marks with tenderness rather than disappointment. To hear Sinatra late was to hear more than the night's performance. It was to hear the stored memory of previous performances, whether personally witnessed or inherited through records. Applause could begin before the song had fully proved itself, because the audience was applauding recognition as much as execution. This is one of the strange privileges of great longevity in public art. The performer receives not only judgment, but gratitude. The room thanks him for what he has already been. Still, Sinatra's standards did not disappear merely because audiences were grateful. He remained sensitive to tempo, arrangement, and the respect due to a song. Even when age made control less absolute, the old musical intelligence continued to govern him. He had spent too many years learning breath, phrasing, and structure to treat performance as mere appearance. The stage persona could become ritual, but the song still required attention. That attention, more than the tuxedo or the nickname or the myth, was the thread that connected the late Sinatra to the young man listening to Bing Crosby and studying Tommy Dorsey. Late fame also strengthened the public habit of simplifying him. To some, he became my way, proud, final, unbending. To others, he became New York, urban, celebratory, triumphant. To others, he remained the saloon singer, the Rat Pack host, the capital master, the difficult celebrity, the loyal friend, the dangerous enemy, the political companion, the romantic ruin, or the old man standing under lights that had followed him too long to be turned off easily. All of these versions held some truth, and none held enough. A long public life does not produce one meaning. It produces a crowd of meanings that continue arguing after the person has left the stage. The late signature songs endured because they gave that crowd something simple to hold. My Way offered self-accounting. New York offered public assent. The Capitol ballads offered loneliness with discipline. The swing records offered charm under control. The duets albums offered continuity by association. Together, they allowed different generations to approach Sinatra through different doors. Some entered through the masterpieces, some entered through ceremony, some entered through family memory. Some entered through songs heard at weddings, funerals, restaurants, ballparks, and late-night radio. By the final years of his performing life, Sinatra's voice had become less an instrument of novelty than an instrument of recognition. The first note could carry decades. The audience did not need to be persuaded that the singer mattered. It needed only to be reminded how the mattering sounded. This changed the emotional economy of the room. A young performer sings forward toward a future not yet secured. An old legend sings through a past already crowded with witnesses. Sinatra's late power lay in making that past briefly present without freezing inside it. The next part of the story narrows toward family, honors, public memory, and the last visible years. Around Sinatra stood children who carried both affection and burden. audiences who treated him as an emblem, institutions that honored him as part of national culture, and a catalogue that increasingly did the work his body could no longer sustain. The songs remained in motion after each performance ended, traveling through records, broadcasts, ceremonies, and private rooms. The man who had spent a lifetime shaping breath into public feeling was moving toward the years when the breath would weaken, while the sound he had already made continued to gather around him. Chapter 13. Family, Honors, and the Last Public Years. Palm Springs became one of the places where Frank Sinatra's later life gathered into a more settled shape. Though settled is a word that always has to be used carefully with him, the desert offered distance from New York, Hollywood, and Las Vegas without truly removing him from any of them. Friends came through, political figures appeared, family visited, musicians and business associates remained near enough when needed, and the old machinery of attention continued to find him. His houses, especially the ones connected to the California desert, became part of the geography of his legend. They belonged to leisure, but also to command, because Sinatra rarely entered a place without wanting to know how it was arranged and who belonged inside it. The later public years placed his family in a difficult position. Nancy Sinatra, Frank Sinatra Jr., and Tina Sinatra were not only his children, they were people born into the field of his fame, and each had to negotiate the inheritance differently. Nancy built a career of her own, especially in the 1960s, when These Boots Are Made for Walking gave her a signature very different from her father's world of standards and orchestras. Frank Jr. became a singer and conductor, living with the burden of carrying the name most directly in music. Tina, who did not pursue the same kind of performance career, later became an important voice in the preservation and narration of family memory. Around all three children, the Sinatra name was gift, burden, invitation, and shadow. Frank Sinatra Jr.'s kidnapping in 1963 had already shown how fame could become danger for a family member rather than merely attention. He was abducted from Harrah's Lake Tahoe when he was 19, then released after ransom was paid. The event was resolved with arrests and convictions, but its place in the family story remained unsettling. For a public man who had spent so much of his life using power, loyalty, and influence to control the terms of rooms and relationships, the kidnapping revealed another truth. Fame could make those close to him visible in ways they had never chosen. It could turn a son's name into an opportunity for strangers. Nancy Sinatra's career brought a different kind of family visibility. Her success in the 1960s did not depend on sounding like her father, and that distinction mattered. She entered popular culture with a sharper, more contemporary image, shaped by fashion, television, and the changing sound of the decade. Their duet Something Stupid became a major hit in 1967, unusual because it placed father and daughter inside a romantic song whose effect depended on the public already knowing who they were. The record could have been awkward, and in some ways its strangeness is part of its charm. It showed how the Sinatra family name had become flexible enough to hold both old authority and new pop presentation, even when the combination carried a curious tension. Frank Jr.'s relationship to the legacy was more directly musical. He understood arrangements, orchestras, and the discipline behind his father's performances, and later worked with his father's music in ways that required both filial knowledge and professional care. To be the son of Frank Sinatra and also a singer was to stand under constant comparison. The public may say it wants inheritance, but it often punishes heirs for not being identical to the original. Frank Jr. carried the name into performances where listeners could not help measuring voice, phrasing, ease, and authority against the man whose recordings had already become part of American memory. Tina Sinatra's later role helped shape how the family story would be told after the height of performance had passed. Family memory is not the same as public memory. Public memory arranges a life into songs, photographs, headlines, films, honors, and scandal. Family memory keeps other materials, habits, tempers, absences, tenderness, loyalties, impatience, rooms after guests have left, and the complicated knowledge of how a famous person exists when the audience is gone. When children of public figures speak, they do not dissolve the myth. but they alter its surface. They remind the world that the icon was also a father, and that being a father inside an icon's life could be both intimate and difficult. Sinatra's honors accumulated as his active career narrowed. Awards, tributes, public ceremonies, presidential recognition, and institutional praise placed him within the official memory of American culture. He received the Kennedy Center Honors in 1983, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1985, and later the Congressional Gold Medal. Such honors matter because they move an entertainer from popularity into national acknowledgement. They do not remove contradiction, and they do not ask the historical record to become simple. They announce that, whatever else must be said, the work has entered a larger inheritance. Ronald Reagan's presidency gave Sinatra a political closeness different from the Kennedy glamour of the early 1960s. Reagan and Sinatra both understood performance, patriotism, image, and loyalty. Though they came through those ideas in different ways, Sinatra performed at Reagan's inaugural events and remained associated with the president's circle. The relationship carried less of the youthful sparkle that had surrounded Kennedy and more of an older ceremonial warmth. It suited the later Sinatra, formal, patriotic, honored, and increasingly treated as a national figure rather than a current challenger in popular taste. The public image softened in some places and hardened in others. To many, Sinatra was now an elder statesman of song, the man whose recordings had accompanied courtship, loneliness, travel, celebration, and long private evenings across several generations. To others, the old stories of temper, alleged mob associations, political grievance, and personal difficulty remained inseparable from the music. Both responses continued because Sinatra had lived too publicly and too forcefully for any single version to settle the matter. His reputation did not become peaceful with age, it became layered. The last performances carried the particular tension of late greatness. Audiences came prepared to honor him, but performance still required the body. Memory could support a singer only so far. Breath, hearing, timing, physical stamina, and concentration all had to report for work. Sinatra's final concert performances in the 1990s showed a man increasingly dependent on monitors, prompts, and the accumulated goodwill of audiences who understood they were no longer hearing the seamless voice of the Capitol years. Yet even diminished command could carry meaning. In a late Sinatra performance, the pause before a phrase could seem filled not only by musical timing, but by decades of recognition. There were evenings when the old instinct still appeared with startling clarity. A line might turn at the end with the familiar conversational intelligence, or a familiar song might briefly regain the authority of earlier years. These moments mattered because they did not pretend time had been defeated. They appeared inside time, marked by it, and therefore more fragile. A young singer's brilliance promises possibility. An old singer's brief recovery of form carries memory, gratitude, and the knowledge that such recoveries cannot be summoned forever. The public often responded with standing ovations before judgment could fully separate itself from affection. That affection had been earned across decades, though not always gently. Audiences were not applauding only the night's vocal result. They were applauding the records in their homes, the films on late television, the songs at family gatherings, the idea of New York lifting itself at the end of a game. The old LP covers, the famous photographs, the stories told by parents and grandparents, and the durable impression of a man who had stood before the microphone as if the room itself had agreed to listen. Late applause becomes a gathering of earlier applause. His children and associates increasingly had to manage not only the man, but the legacy forming around him while he was still alive. A famous career, as it nears its close, begins to turn into an archive before the person has left it. Recordings are reissued, documentaries prepared, interviews requested, tribute albums imagined, and family recollections invited. Sinatra's life had generated too much material for memory to remain informal. There were contracts, master recordings, photographs, film rights, business interests, public ceremonies, and the careful question of how much of the private man should be given to the public that had already taken so much. The preservation of his catalogue became one of the central facts of his later afterlife in advance. Capitol and Reprise recordings were no longer only products of their original years. They had become reference points, studied by singers, arrangers, critics, and listeners trying to understand phrasing, breath, sequencing, and interpretation. The great albums did not age in the same way as many topical entertainments because they had been built from songs already durable and performances already disciplined. Their surfaces carried the marks of mid-century recording, but the emotional architecture remained available. A listener coming to them decades later could still hear the intelligence of the line. Television tributes and public appearances helped place Sinatra before younger viewers who had not encountered him through the original rise. These viewers met him as legend first and singer second, which changes the order of understanding. For the wartime audience, the voice preceded the monument. For later audiences, the monument often preceded the voice. They had heard the name, seen the image, absorbed the references, and only then perhaps turned to the records. Sinatra's late public years had to carry both kinds of audience at once, those who remembered becoming fans, and those who had inherited the instruction that he mattered. The emotional center of this period lay in the gradual separation between Sinatra the working performer and Sinatra the recorded presence. The working performer aged, forgot, tired, recovered, appeared, withdrew, and became less able to command every night. The recorded presence remained young, mature, wounded, swinging, lonely, amused, and masterful according to whichever disc was played. This split happens to all recording artists who live long enough. But in Sinatra's case, it was especially vivid because the recordings had captured so many versions of him. The archive did not preserve one voice, it preserved a sequence of selves. Family, honors, and final appearances therefore did not close the story so much as prepare it for the form it would take after him. His children would carry parts of the memory, institutions would carry the awards and official tributes. Critics would continue to argue about the recordings. Biographers would return to the marriages, politics, friendships, and allegations. Singers would study the phrasing whether they loved the myth or not. And ordinary listeners, whose names never enter the public record, would keep the songs alive in the simplest way by playing them again. Sinatra's last years brought the public figure closer to stillness, though his reputation remained restless. The places around him, Palm Springs, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Hoboken, New York, had become chapters in a geography of American entertainment. The family name had become both personal inheritance and cultural property. The honors had placed him within national memory, while the old controversies kept the memory from becoming too smooth. Around him, the century that had carried his voice was nearing its own end. The next movement would be quieter because it would begin with absence, and with the strange way a voice can become more widely present after the body that made it has gone silent. Chapter 14. After the applause, Frank Sinatra died in Los Angeles on May 14, 1998, and the news moved through America with the particular force reserved for figures who have been present for so long that their absence feels less like a private fact than a change in public weather. He was 82 years old. The body that had carried the voice through Hoboken rooms, dance bands, wartime theaters, Hollywood sets, Capitol studios, Las Vegas showrooms, presidential circles, arenas, television specials, and final tributes had reached the end of its working life. Yet the sound did not stop moving. Before the official statements settled, before the tributes were arranged, before the full machinery of remembrance had gathered itself, the recordings were already doing what recordings do. They returned the dead to rooms where the living still had electricity, speakers, radios, and memory. The public response was immediate because Sinatra had belonged to several generations at once. For older listeners, he was tied to youth, war, courtship, nightclubs, first records, and the long passage from the 1940s into the late 20th century. For younger listeners, he was already a monument, a figure encountered through parents, films, commercials, ballparks, television retrospectives, and songs that seemed to have existed before anyone remembered first hearing them. His death, therefore, did not belong to one audience. It passed through many layers of American culture, touching people who had known different Sinatras and sometimes had little agreement about which one mattered most. The obituaries could not easily contain him. They had to name the singer, the actor, the Oscar winner, the recording artist, the Las Vegas figure, the friend of presidents, the subject of FBI files, the man shadowed by allegations, the husband of famous women, the father, the label founder, the temperamental loyalist, the difficult celebrity, and the craftsman whose phrasing had altered popular singing. A shorter life can sometimes be arranged around a single achievement. Sinatra's life resisted that arrangement. It had too many rooms, and in each one, some different version of him had left a mark. His burial at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City placed the final physical fact of his life in the California desert near Palm Springs, one of the landscapes most associated with his later years. The choice suited the long westward movement of the career. Hoboken had given him origin, New York had given him stages and radio, Hollywood had given him damage and restoration, Las Vegas had given him command, and the desert had given him a late geography of houses, friends, honors, and retreat. A grave is a still thing, but around Sinatra's grave gathered a life that had rarely been still for long. Tributes filled newspapers, broadcasts, and television programs. Songs returned to the air with the solemn familiarity that comes when a public voice is heard after death. My Way carried the obvious weight, though it could never hold all of him. New York, New York supplied a more public brightness, the city song that had become larger than the film from which it came. The capital ballads brought listeners back to loneliness shaped with discipline. The swing records restored the quick intelligence of tempo and timing. Each song called up a different room, a different suit, a different age of the face, a different pressure behind the breath. The recordings became the most reliable witnesses. People who knew Sinatra personally could argue over temperament, loyalty, cruelty, generosity, politics, rumor, and private conduct. Critics could rank albums, examine arrangements, and trace influence. Historians could place him inside immigration, mass media, wartime culture, celebrity politics, race, organized crime suspicion, and the long business history of entertainment. But the recordings remained available without explanation. A listener could place a needle, press a button, or tune a station and meet the work before meeting the argument. In the end, this is one of recorded music's quiet powers. It does not settle the life, but it preserves the labor. Sinatra's influence on later singers is difficult to measure because it entered the craft at a deep level. Many singers learned from him without sounding exactly like him. They studied the way he delayed a phrase, broke a line according to speech rather than bar lines, approached consonants, trusted silence, and treated the lyric as something that had to be understood before it could be sung. He did not possess the largest voice of his century, nor the purest, nor the most technically imposing in every conventional measure. His greatness lay elsewhere, in the union of musical intelligence, emotional timing, breadth, and authority. He made interpretation itself feel like the center of the art. The Capitol years remained the clearest school for that influence. In the Wee Small Hours, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Where Are You, Come Fly With Me, Only the Lonely, and the other great recordings of that period continued to show how arrangement, sequencing, cover design, and vocal presence could make an album feel unified without forcing a literal story onto it. Long after the LP era had passed into newer formats, those albums still carried the logic of the object they had once been. Two sides, a mood, a sleeve, a room arranged by sound. They belonged to mid-century technology, yet they did not remain trapped inside it. Reprise added another layer to the legacy. Sinatra's desire for ownership anticipated later battles over masters, artistic control, and the right of performers to govern their own recorded work. The label did not remain independent in the pure form that its founding may have imagined, but its existence mattered. It showed a major artist trying to move from employee to institution, from voice within a company to name on the company itself. That attempt belongs to Sinatra's larger history of control. He wanted to control rooms, songs, friendships, political access, business structures, and public memory. He never fully controlled any of them, but the attempt shaped the life. The films also remained, though unevenly. From Here to Eternity retained its central importance because it had changed the direction of his career and because the performance still carries the compact force of a man given exactly the right smallness. The Manchurian Candidate endured for different reasons, tied to Cold War anxiety and political nightmare. The lighter musicals and Rat Pack films preserved other surfaces: the youthful singer, the relaxed friend, the Vegas figure, the screen presence sometimes stronger than the script around him. Film fixed his face in stages, allowing later viewers to watch time move across him in ways the records alone could not show. The darker areas did not disappear after death. Public memory sometimes tries to polish its icons until they can be admired without discomfort. But Sinatra resisted that polishing. Allegations of organized crime associations, accounts of temper and intimidation, complicated political shifts, broken friendships, difficult marriages, and stories of private cruelty remained part of the archive. So did stories of loyalty, generosity, professional respect, civil rights support in certain moments, and deep commitment to friends. A serious chronicle does not need to choose between these because the life contained them together. The difficulty is not that Sinatra lacked contradiction. The difficulty is that contradiction was one of the forms his force took. For some listeners, the moral complications changed the sound. For others, the sound remained separate enough to survive the knowledge. Most people lived somewhere between those positions, hearing the records through admiration, caution, inheritance, pleasure, discomfort, and the ordinary human habit of accepting that art and character rarely lie in a simple line. Sinatra's case remains especially charged because the image itself was so bound to command. He did not present as fragile genius withdrawn from public power. He presented as a man who wanted power and often held it. That makes the beauty of the singing more complicated, not less historically important. His death also belonged to the end of a century he had helped make audible. Born before commercial radio had become the central household force it would soon be, he lived long enough to see compact discs, music television, mass nostalgia industries, and digitally prepared legacies. He entered public life through microphones that made crooning possible, through records that could be held in the hand, through theaters where fans gathered in physical crowds. He left a world where his voice could be copied, remastered, broadcast globally, inserted into films and advertisements, studied by scholars, and played in private by people born long after the bobby-soxers had aged into grandparents. Hoboken remembered him in its own way. The city that he had left became part of the pilgrimage of memory, with streets, plaques, sites, and local pride attaching themselves to the boy who had crossed into a larger world. The relationship between origin and fame is never simple. A hometown can feel abandoned by the one who leaves, then later claim him as proof of its own possibility. Sinatra's Hoboken remained both real and symbolic, a dense immigrant city of his childhood and a shorthand for the distance traveled. The boy from Hoboken phrase became one of the ways America told the story of self-making, even when the full life refused the neatness of that phrase. New York remembered him differently, through performance, scale, and anthem. Las Vegas remembered him through showroom mythology, the sands, the Rat Pack, and the vanished world of mid-century casino glamour. Hollywood remembered the comeback and the films. Palm Springs remembered the private houses and the late circle. Washington remembered honors and political proximity. Each place kept a different Sinatra, and none possessed the whole. Geography became a map of reinventions. The family remained central to the management of memory. Nancy, Frank Jr., and Tina carried different relationships to the name, the music, and the public appetite for stories. Estates do not preserve only property, they preserve versions. Decisions about reissues, documentaries, licensing, tributes, and public statements all influence how a figure continues to live in culture. With Sinatra, the archive was unusually rich and unusually contested. There were recordings enough for worship, documents enough for scrutiny, photographs enough for myth, and stories enough for disagreement. The final measure of Sinatra's legacy may rest less in the size of the fame than in the durability of the listening. Fame can survive as reference after the work has gone cold. Sinatra's work did not go cold. The best records still ask for attention, not because they are famous, but because they are alive with choices. A line lands behind the beat. A word receives less pressure than expected and therefore means more. A breath disappears where a lesser singer would reveal it. An arrangement opens space, and Sinatra steps into it with the old confidence that the lyric, properly handled, will carry the rest. That confidence had been made across a lifetime. Dolly Sinatra's force, Marty's working steadiness, Hoboken's crowded pressure, Crosby's microphone intimacy, Dorsey's breath, the bobby-soxer crowds, the Columbia softness, the Ava Gardner wound, Maggio's smallness, Capitol's architecture, the Sands command, Kennedy's withdrawal, Reprise's ownership, Retirement's pause, the late songs, the family archive, and the final honors all moved into the public memory after his death. Not as a clean sequence, and not as a moral lesson, but as layers behind a sound. The listener does not have to know all of it to hear the phrasing. Yet the phrasing becomes richer when the life around it is understood. In the years after 1998, younger singers continue to approach Sinatra as both model and danger. The model was clear: respect the lyric, learn the breath, trust the arrangement, make the song feel spoken without flattening its music. The danger was imitation. Sinatra's gestures, if copied on the surface, can become costume quickly. The hat, the loosened tie, the clipped swing, the saloon melancholy, the swagger before the band, these are easy to borrow badly. The deeper inheritance is harder. It lies in decision, proportion, restraint, and the willingness to make each song appear inevitable only after great care has been taken. The public memory continued to simplify him because public memory often needs handles. He became the chairman of the board, old blue eyes, the voice, the saloon singer, the man who did it his way, the singer of New York, the leader of the Rat Pack, the comeback king. Each label preserved something and reduced something. The real historical figure moved through all of them, never fully held by any. He had been too ambitious for one name, too wounded for pure glamour, too disciplined for mere celebrity, too volatile for easy reverence, and too gifted for dismissal. Toward the end, the story no longer needs another return. Sinatra had spent much of his life returning, from Hoboken obscurity, from band subordination, from career collapse, from political humiliation, from retirement, from the narrowing of age. After death, return changed form. It no longer required his will. The records returned for him. They entered hotel lobbies, kitchens, cars, headphones, documentaries, weddings, empty bars before opening, radio hours near midnight, and quiet rooms where someone wanted a song to carry feeling without forcing it into speech. A record sleeve may rest for years on a shelf before a hand draws it out again. The surface may hold a little dust, the paper edge softened by handling, the photograph fixed in a version of time that no longer changes. Then the music begins, and the old separation narrows for a while. The room does not become 1940 or 1955 or 1966 or 1979. It remains itself. But into it comes a line shaped long ago by breath, arrangement, memory, and the careful pressure of a singer who understood that a song could stand very near the listener without asking to be explained. The places remain scattered. Hoboken along the river, Capitol Studios under California light, the vanished sands preserved in photographs and recollection, Palm Springs holding its dry air and low roofs, Desert Memorial Park with its still ground. None of them contains the story alone. They are markers left behind after motion, as if a life that kept moving through rooms, cities, contracts, marriages, rumors, stages, and songs had finally become a set of quiet coordinates. The sound is less still. It continues wherever the recordings continue, not as a ghostly thing, and not as a lesson, but as stored breath released again through ordinary machines. A needle lowers, a speaker warms, a digital file opens, a familiar introduction gathers itself, and the voice that once needed a living body passes into the room without effort. Around it there may be lamplight, traffic, the faint grain of old vinyl, the soft click of a player changing tracks, or only the clean silence before another song begins. The journey is complete. Rest well.